Chapter 5 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 5. Babbitt's preparations for leaving the office to its feeble self during the hour and a half of his lunch period were somewhat less elaborate than the plans for a general European war. He fretted to Miss McGowan, "What time are you going to lunch?" "Well, make sure Miss Bannigan is in then. Explain to her that if Weinfeld calls up, she's to tell him I'm already having this title traced. And oh, by the way, remind me tomorrow to have Penniman trace it. Now, if anybody comes in looking for a cheap house, remember, we got to shove that Banger Road place off onto somebody. If you need me, I'll be at the athletic club, and, I'll be back by 2." He dusted the cigar ashes off his vest. He placed a difficult unanswered letter on the pile of unfinished work, that he might not fail to attend to it that afternoon. For 3 noons now he had placed that same letter on the unfinished pile. He scrawled on a sheet of yellow backing paper the memorandum, "See about apartment H.D.R.S.," which gave him an agreeable feeling of having already seen about the apartment house doors. He discovered that he was smoking another cigar. He threw it away, protesting, "Darn it, thought you'd quit the damn smoking." He courageously returned the cigar box to the correspondence file, locked it up, hid the key in a more difficult place, and raged, "Ought to take care of it myself. Need more exercise. Walk to the club every single noon. Just what I'll do. Cut out this motoring all the time." The resolution made him feel exemplary. Immediately after he decided that this noon it was too late to walk. It took but little more time to start his car and edge it into the traffic than it would have taken to walk the 3.5 blocks to the club. 2. As he drove, he glanced with fondness of familiarity at the buildings. A stranger suddenly dropped into the business center of Zenith. Could not have told whether he was in a city of Oregon or Georgia, Ohio or Maine, Oklahoma or Manitoba, but to Babbitt every inch was individual and stirring. As always, he noted that the California building across the way was 3 stories lower, therefore 3 stories less beautiful than his own Reeves building. As always, when he passed the Parthenon shoeshine parlor, a 1-story hut which, beside the granite and red-brick ponderness of the old California building, resembled a bath-house under a cliff, he commented, "Gosh, ought to get my shoes shined this afternoon. Keep forgetting it." At the Simplex office furniture shop, the National Cash Register Agency, he yearned for a dictaphone, for a typewriter, which would add and multiply as a poet yearns for quartos or a physician for radium. At the Newby menswear shop he took his left hand off the steering wheel to touch his scarf, and thought well of himself as one who bought expensive ties and could pay cash for 'em, too, by golly. And at the United Cigar Store, with its crimson and gold alertness, he reflected, "Wonder if I need some cigars. Idiot, plumb forgot. Going to cut down my fool smoking." He looked at his bank, the Miners and Drovers National, and considered how clever and solid he was to bank with so marbled an establishment. His high moment came in the clash of traffic when he was halted at the corner beneath the lofty Second National Tower. His car was banked with 4 others in a line of steel restless as cavalry, while across town traffic, limousines and enormous moving vans and insistent motorcycles poured by. On the further corner, pneumatic riveters rang on the sun-plated skeleton of a new building, and out of this tornado flashed the inspiration of a familiar face, and a fellow booster shouted, "Hey, how you, Georgie?" Babbitt waved in neighborly affection, and slid on with the traffic as the policeman lifted his hand. He noted how quickly his car picked up. He felt superior and powerful, like a shuttle of polished steel darting in a vast machine. As always, he ignored the next 2 blocks, decayed blocks not yet reclaimed from the grime and shabbiness of the Zenith of 1885. While he was passing the 5 and 10-cent store, the Dakota Lodging House, Concordia Hall with its lodge rooms, and the offices of fortune-tellers and chiropractors, he thought of how much money he made, and he boasted a little and worried a little, and did old familiar sums. 450 plunks this morning from the land deal, but taxes due. Let's see.
Ought to pull out 8,000 net this year and save 1,500 of that. No, not if I put up the garage and let's see, 640 clear last month and 12 times 640 makes let's see, 6 times 12 is 7,200 and all rats. Anyway, I'll make 8,000. Gee, now that's not so bad. Mighty good fellows pulling down $8,000 a year. 8,000 good hard iron dollars. Bet there isn't more than 5% of the people in the whole United States that make more than Uncle George does, by golly. Right up at the top of the heap. But why, expenses are family wasting gasoline, always dressed like millionaires, and sending that 80 a month to mother, and all these stenographers and salesmen gouging me for every cent they can get.
The effect of his scientific budget planning was that he felt at once triumphantly wealthy and perilously poor, and in the midst of these dissertations he stopped his car, rushed into a small news and miscellany shop, and bought the electric cigar lighter which he had coveted for a week. He dodged his conscience by being jerky and noisy, and by shouting at the clerk, "Guess this'll pretty near pay for itself in matches, eh?" It was a pretty thing, a nickel cylinder with an almost silvery socket, to be attached to the dashboard of his car. It was not only, as the placard on the counter observed, a dainty little refinement lending the last touch of class to the gentleman's auto, but a priceless time-saver. By freeing him from halting the car to light a match, it would in a month or two easily save 10 minutes. As he drove on he glanced at it.
"Pretty nice. Always wanted one," he said wistfully. "The one thing a smoker needs, too."
Then he remembered that he had given up smoking.
"Darn it!" he mourned. "Oh, well, I guess I'll hit a cigar once in a while, and be a great convenience for other folks. Might make just a difference in getting chummy with some fellow that would put over sailing. Certainly looks nice there. Certainly a mighty clever little jigger. Gives the last touch of refinement and class, and by golly, I guess I can afford it if I want to. Not going to be the only member of this family never has a single doggone luxury."
Thus, laden with treasure, after 3.5 blocks of romantic adventure, he drove up to the club. 3. The Zenith Athletic Club is not athletic, and it isn't exactly a club, but it is Zenith in perfection. It has an active and smoke-misted billiard room. It is represented by baseball and football teams, and in the pool and gymnasium a tenth of the members sporadically try to reduce. But most of its 3,000 members use it as a cafe in which to lunch, play cards, tell stories, meet customers, and entertain out-of-town uncles at dinner. It is the largest club in the city, and its chief hatred is the conservative Union Club, which all sound members of the Athletic call a rotten, snobbish, dull, expensive old hole. Not one good mixer in the place. You couldn't hire me to join. Statistics show that no member of the Athletic has ever refused election to the Union, and of those who are elected, 67% resign from the Athletic and thereafter heard to say in a drowsy sanctity of the Union lounge, "Oh, the Athletic would be a pretty good hotel if it were more exclusive." The Athletic Club building is 9 stories high, yellow brick, with glossy roof garden above the portico of huge limestone columns below. The lobby, with its thick pillars of porous Kenning stone, its pointed vaulting, and a brown glazed tile floor, like well-baked bread crust, is a combination of cathedral crypt and rathskeller. The members rush into the lobby as though they were shopping, and had much time for it. Thus did Babbitt enter, and to the group standing by the cigar counter he whooped, "How's the boys? How's the boys? Well, well, fine day." Jovially they whooped back. Virgil Gunch, the coal dealer; Sidney Finkelstein, the ladies' ready-to-wear buyer for Parcher and Stearns department store; and Professor Joseph K. Pumphrey, owner of the Right Way Business College and instructor in public speaking, business English, scenario writing, and commercial law. Though Babbitt admired the savant and appreciated Sidney Finkelstein as a mighty smart buyer and a good liberal spender, it was to Virgil Gunch that he turned with enthusiasm. Mr. Gunch was the president of the Boosters Club, a weekly lunch club, local chapter of a national organization which promoted sound business and friendliness among regular fellows. He was also no less an official than esteemed leading knight in the benevolent and protective order of the Elks, and it was rumored that at the next election he would be a candidate for exalted ruler. He was a jolly man, given to oratory and to chumminess with the arts. He called on the famous actors and vaudeville artists when they came to town, gave them cigars, addressed them by their first names, and sometimes succeeded in bringing them to the Booster Club lunches to give the boys a free entertainment. He was a large man with hair and brows, and he knew the latest jokes, but he played poker close to the chest. It was at his party that Babbitt had sucked in the virus of today's restlessness.
Gunch shouted, "How was the old Bolshevsky? How do you feel the morning after the night before?" "Oh, boy, some head! That was a regular party you threw, Verge. Hope you haven't forgotten I took that last cute little jackpot," Babbitt bellowed.
He was 3 feet from Gunch. "That's all right now. What I'll hand you next time, Georgie. Say, did you notice in the paper the way the New York Assembly stood up to the Reds?"
"You bet I did. That was fine. Nice day today."
"Yes, it's one mighty fine spring day, but night's still cold."
"Yeah, you're right, they are. Had to have a couple blankets last night out on the sleeping porch. Say, Sid," Babbitt turned to Finkelstein, the buyer, "got something I want to ask you about. I went out and bought me an electric cigar lighter for the car this noon, and—"
"Good hunch," said Finkelstein, while even the learned Professor Pumperoy, a bulbous man with a pepper and salt cutaway and a pipe organ voice, commented, "That's a dandy accessory. Cigarette lighter gives tone to the dashboard."
"Yep, finally decided I'd buy me one. Got the best on the market. Clerk said it was. Paid $5 for it. Just wondering if I got stuck. What they charge for 'em at your store, Sid?"
Finkelstein asserted that $5 was not too great a sum, not for a really high-class lighter which was suitably nickeled and provided with connections of the very best quality.
"I always say, and believe me, I based it on a pretty fairly extensive mercantile experience, the best is the cheapest in the long run. Of course, if a fellow wants to be a Jew about it, he could get cheap junk, but in the long run, the cheapest thing is the best you can get. Now you take this the other day I got a new top from Old Boat and some upholstery, and I paid out $126.50. And of course a lot of fellows would say that was too much. Lord, if the old folks, they live in one of these hick towns upstate, and they simply can't get on to the way a city fellow's mind works. And then, of course, they're Jews, and they'd lie down and die if they knew that Sid added up 126 bones. But I don't figure I was stuck, George, not a bit. Machine looks brand new. Not that it's so darned old, of course. It's had less than 3 years, but I give it a hard service. Never drive less than 100 miles on Sunday. I really don't think you got stuck, George. In the long run, the best is, you might say, it's unquestionably the cheapest."
"That's right," said Vergil Gunch. "That's the way I look at it. If a fellow is keyed up to what you might call intensive living, the way you get it here in Zenith, all the hustle and mental activity that's going on with a bunch of live wires like the Boosters and here at the ZAC, why, he's got to save his nerves by having the best." Babbitt nodded his head at every fifth word in the roaring rhythm, and the conclusion in Gunch's renowned humorous vein. He was enchanted. "Still, at that, George, don't know as you can afford it. I've heard your business is kind of under the eye of the government since you stole the tail of Eathorne Park and sold it."
"Oh, you're a great little josher, Verge. But when it comes to kidding, how about this report that you stole the black marble steps off the post office and sold them for a high-grade coal?"
In delight, Babbitt patted Gunch's back and stroked his arm.
"That's all right. But what I want to know is who's the real estate shark that bought that coal for his apartment houses?"
"I guess that'll hold you for a while, Georgie," said Finkelstein.
"I'll tell you, though, boys, what I did here. George's missus went into the gents' wear department at Parcher's to buy him some collars, and before she could give his neck size, the clerk slips her some 13s. 'How'd you know the size?' says Miss Babbitt. And the clerk says, 'Men that let their wives buy collars for 'em always wear 13, madam.' How's that? That's pretty good, eh? How's that, eh? I guess that'll about fix you, George."
I Babbitt sought for amiable insults in answer. He stopped, stared at the door. Paul Riesling was coming in. Babbitt cried, "See you later, boys," and hastened across the lobby. He was, just then, neither the sulky child of the sleeping porch, the domestic tyrant of the breakfast table, the crafty money changer of the lighty-purty conference, nor the blaring good fellow, the josher and regular guy of the athletic club. He was an older brother to Paul Riesling, swift to defend him, admiring him with proud, incredulous love, passing the love of women. Paul and he shook hands solemnly. They smiled as shyly as though they had been parted 3 years, not 3 days, and they said, "How's the old horse thief?"
"All right, I guess. How you poor shrimp?"
"I'm first rate, you second-hand hunk of cheese." Reassured thus of their fondness, Babbitt grunted,
"You're a fine guy, you are. 10 minutes late."
Riesling laughed. "Well, you're lucky to have a chance to have lunch with a gentleman." They grinned and went into the Norwegian washroom, where a line of men bent over the bowls insert along a prestigious slab of marble, as in religious prostration before their own images in the massy mirror. Voices, thick, satisfied, authoritative, hurled along the marble walls, bounded from the ceiling of lavender-colored milky tiles, while the lords of the city, the barons of insurance and law and fertilizers and motor tires, laid down the law for Zenith, announced that the day was warm indeed, indisputably of spring, that wages were too high and the interest on mortgages too low, that Babe Ruth, the eminent player of baseball, was a noble man, and that those two nuts at the Climax Vaudeville Theater this week certainly are a slick pair of actors. Babbitt, though ordinarily his voice was the surest and most episcopal of all, was silent in the presence of the slight, dark reticence of Paul Riesling. He was awkward. He desired to be quiet and firm and deft. The entrance lobby of the athletic club was Gothic, the washroom Roman Imperial, the lounge Spanish Mission, and the reading room in Chinese Chippendale, but the gem of the club was the dining room, the masterpiece of Ferdinand Reitman, Zenith's busiest architect. It was lofty and half-timbered, with Tudor-leaded casements, an oriel, a somewhat musicianless musician's gallery, and tapestries believed to illustrate the granting of Magna Carta. The open beams had been hand-azed by Jake Offutt's Car Body Works. The hinge were of hand-wrought iron, the waistcoat studded with hand-made wooden pegs, and at one end of the room was a heraldic and hooded stone fireplace, which the club's advertising pamphlet asserted not only to be larger than any of the fireplaces in European castles, but of a draught incomparably more scientific. It was also much cleaner, as no fire had ever been built in it. Half of the tables were mammoth slabs which seated 20 or 30 men. Babbitt usually sat at the one near the door, with a group including Gunch, Finkelstein, Professor Pumphrey, Howard Littlefield, his neighbor T. Charmaldy Fink, the poet and advertising agent, and Orville Jones, whose laundry was in many ways the best in Zenith. They composed a club within the club. They merrily called themselves the Roughnecks. Today, as he passed their table, the Roughnecks greeted him. "Come on, sit down. You and Paul too proud to feed with poor folks? Afraid somebody might stick you for a bottle of Bevo? George, strikes me as you swells are getting awful darn exclusive." He thundered, "You bet! We can't afford to have our reps ruined by being seen with you tightwads," and guided Paul to one of the small tables beneath the musicians' gallery. He felt guilty. At the Zenith Athletic Club privacy was very bad form, but he wanted Paul to himself. That morning he had advocated lighter lunches, and now he ordered nothing but English mutton chop, radishes, peas, deep-dish apple pie, a bit of cheese, and a pot of coffee with cream, adding, as he did invariably, "And, you might give me an order of French fried potatoes." When the chop came, he vigorously peppered it and salted it. He always peppered and salted his meat, and vigorously, before tasting it. Paul and he took up the spring-like quality of the spring, the virtues of the electric cigar lighter, and the action of the New York State Assembly. It was not until Babbitt was thick and disconsolate with mutton grease that he flung out,
I wound up a nice little deal with Conrad Lighty this morning, and put 500 good plunks in my pocket. Pretty nice, pretty nice. And yet, I don't know what's the matter with me today. Maybe it's an attack of spring fever, or staying up too late at Verge Gunch's, or maybe it's just the winter's work piling up. But I felt kind of down in the mouth all day long. Of course, I wouldn't beef about it to fellows at the Roughnecks table there, but you ever feel that way, Paul? Kind of comes over me here. I've pretty much done all the things I ought to do. Supported my family, and got a good house, and a six-cylinder car. Built up a nice little business. I haven't any vices, especially except smoking, and I'm practically cutting that one out, by the way. And I belong to the church and play enough golf to keep in trim, and I only associate with good, decent fellows. And yet, even so, I don't know that I'm entirely satisfied."
It was drawled out, broken by shouts from the neighboring tables, by mechanical love-making to the waitresses, by strenuous grunts as the coffee filled him with dizziness and indigestion. He was apologetic and doubtful, and it was Paul, with his thin voice, who pierced the fog. "Good Lord, George, you don't suppose it's any novelty to me to find that we hustlers, that think we're so all-fired successful, aren't getting much out of it? You look as if you expected me to report you as sedacious. You know what my own life's been."
"I know, man."
"I ought to have been a fiddler, and I'm a peddler of tar roofing. And Zilla, oh, I don't want to squeal, but you know as well as I do about how inspiring a wife she is. Typical instance last evening. We went to the movies. There was a big crowd waiting in the lobby, us at the tail end. She began to push right through it with her 'Sir, how dare you' manner. Honestly, sometimes when I look at her and see how she's always so made up and stinking of perfume and looking for trouble and kind of always yelping, 'I'll tell you, I'm a lady, damn you!' why, I want to kill her. Well, she keeps elbowing through the crowd, me after her, feeling good and ashamed, till she's almost up at the velvet rope and ready to be next let in. But there was a little squirt of a man there, probably been waiting half an hour. I kind of admired the little cuss. And he turns to Zilla and says, perfectly polite, 'Madam, why are you trying to push past me?' And she simply, God, I was so ashamed, she rips out at him, 'You're no gentleman.' And she drags me into it and hollers, 'Paul, this person insulted me.' And the poor skate, he got ready to fight. I made out I hadn't hurt him. Sure, same as you wouldn't hear a boiler factory, and tried to look away. I can tell you exactly how every tile looks in the ceiling of that lobby. There's one with brown spots on it like the face of the devil, and all the time the people there, they were packed in like sardines. They kept making remarks about us, and Zilly went right on talking about the little chap, and screeching that folks like him oughtn't to be admitted in a place that's supposed to be for ladies and gentlemen. And, Paul, will you kindly call the manager so I can report this dirty rat? And, maybe I wasn't glad when I could sneak inside and hide in the dark. After 24 years of that kind of thing, you don't expect me to fall down and foam at the mouth when you hint that this sweet, clean, respectable, moral life isn't all it's cracked up to be, do you? I can't even talk about it, except to you, because anybody else would think I was yellow. Maybe I am. Don't care any longer. Gosh, you've had to stand a lot of whining for me, first and last, Georgie."
"Rats! Now, Paul, you'll never really what you could call whined. Sometimes I'm always blowing on Myra and the kids about that whale of a realtor I am, and yet sometimes I get a sneaking idea I'm not such a Pierpont Morgan as I let on to be. But if I ever do help by jollying you along, old Paul Insky, I guess maybe St. Pete may let me in after all." "Yeah, you're a blowhard, Georgie, you cheerful cutthroat, but you've certainly kept me going." "Well, why don't you divorce Celia?"
"Why don't I? If I only could. If she'd just give me the chance. You couldn't hire her to divorce me, no, nor desert me. She's too fond of her 3 squares and a few pounds of nut-centered chocolates in between. If she'd only be what they call unfaithful to me, George. I don't want to be too much of a stinker. Back in college
I'd have thought a man who could say that ought to be shot at sunrise. But honestly, I'd be tickled to death if she'd really go making love with somebody. Fat chance, of course. She'll flirt with anything, but you know how she holds her hands and laughs. That laugh, that horrible brassy laugh, the way she yaps, "You naughty man, you better be careful or my big husband will be after you." And the guy looking me over and thinking, "Why, you cute little thing, you run away now or I'll spank you." And she'll let him go just far enough so she gets some excitement out of it, and then she'll begin to do the injured innocent and have a beautiful time wailing. I don't think you were that kind of a person. They talk about the demi-virgins of stories." "These whats?" "But the wise, hard, consorted old married women like Zilla are worse than any bobbed-haired girl that ever went boldly out in this here storm of life and kept her umbrella slid up her sleeve. But rats, you know what Zilla is, how she nags, 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 how she wants everything I can buy her and a lot that I can't, and how absolutely unreasonable she is, and what I get sore and try to have it out on her she plays the perfect lady so well that even I get fooled and get all tangled up in a lot of 'why did you say's' and 'I didn't mean's.' I'll tell you, Georgie, you know my tastes are pretty fairly simple, in the matter of food, at least. Course, as you're always complaining, I do like decent cigars, not those Flor de Cabagos you're smoking." "That's all right now. That's a good two-for. By the way, Paul, did I tell you I decided to practically cut out smoke?"
Yes, you. At the same time, if I can't get what I like, why, I can do without it. I don't mind sitting down to burnt steak with canned peaches and store cake for a thrilling little dessert afterwards, but I do draw the line at having to sympathize with Zilla because she's so rotten bad-tempered that the cook has quit, and she's been so busy sitting in a dirty lace negligee all afternoon reading about some brave, manly Western hero that she hasn't had time to do any cooking. You're always talking about morals, meaning monogamy, I suppose. You've been the rock of ages to me, all right, but you're essentially a simp, you—"
"What do you get that simp, little man? Let me tell you."
"Love to look earnest and inform the world that it's the duty of responsible business men to be strictly moral, as an example to the community. In fact, you're so earnest about morality, old George, that I hate to think how essentially immoral you must be underneath. All right, you can—"
Wait now, what's—"
"Talk about morals all you want to, old thing, but believe me, if it hadn't been for you and an occasional evening playing of the violin to Terrell O'Farrell's Ocello, and 3 or 4 darling girls that let me forget this beastly joke they call respectable life, I'd have killed myself years ago. And business, the roofing business, roofs for cowsheds. Oh, I don't mean I haven't had a lot of fun out in the game, out of putting it over on the labor unions and seeing the big check coming in and the business increasing. But what's the use of it? You know my business isn't distributing roofing. It's principally keeping my competitors from distributing roofing. Same as with you. All we do is cut each other's throats and make the public pay for it."
Look here now, Paul, you're pretty darn near talking socialism."
"Oh, yes, of course. I don't really exactly mean that. Suppose, of course, competition brings out the best, survival of the fittest, but I mean, take all those fellows we know, the kind right here in the club, now, that seem to be perfectly content with their home life and their businesses, and that boosts Zenith and the Chamber of Commerce and holler for a million population. I bet if you could cut into their heads, you'd find that 1/3 of 'em are sure enough satisfied with their wives and kids and friends in their offices, and 1/3 feel kind of restless, but won't admit it, and 1/3 are miserable and know it. They hate the whole peppy, boosting, go-ahead game, and they're bored with their wives, and think their families are fools. At least when they come to 40 or 45 they're bored, and they hate business, and they go. Why do you suppose there's so many mysterious suicides? Why do you suppose so many substantial citizens jumped right into the war? Think it was all patriotism?"
Babbitt snorted. "What do you expect? Think we were sent into the world to have a soft time and, what is it, float on flowery beds of ease? Think man was made just to be happy?"
"Why not?
though I've never discovered anybody that knew what the deuce man really was made for." "Well, we know, not just in the Bible alone, but it stands to reason. A man who doesn't buckle down and do his duty, even if it does bore him sometimes, is nothing but well, he's simply a weakling. Mollycoddle, in fact. And what do you advocate? Come down to cases. If a man is bored by his wife, do you seriously mean he has a right to chuck her and take a sneak, or even kill himself?" "Good Lord, I don't know what's right man has, and I don't know the solutions of boredom. If I did, I'd be the one philosopher that had the cure for living. But I do know that about 10 times as many people find their lives dull and unnecessarily dull as ever admit it. And I do believe that if we busted out and admitted it sometimes, instead of being nice and patient and loyal for 60 years, and then nice and patient and dead for the rest of eternity, why, maybe, possibly, we might make life more fun." They drifted into a maze of speculation. Babbitt was elephantlishly uneasy. Paul was bold, but not quite sure about what he was being bold. Now and then Babbitt suddenly agreed with Paul in an admission which contradicted all his defense of duty and Christian patience, and at each admission he had a curious, reckless joy. He said at last, "Look here, old Paul, you do a lot of talking about kicking things in the face, but you never kick. Why don't you?" "Nobody does. Habit too strong. But, Georgie, I've been thinking of one mild bat. Oh, don't worry, old pillar of monogamy. It's highly proper. It seems to be settled now, isn't it? Though, of course, Zilla keeps rooting for a nice, expensive vacation in New York and Atlantic City, with the bright lights and the bootlegged cocktails and a bunch of lounge lizards to dance with. But the Babbitts and the Rieslings are sure enough going to Lake Sunasquam, aren't we? Why couldn't you and I make some excuse, say business in New York, and get up to Maine 4 or 5 days before they do, and just loaf by ourselves and smoke and cuss and be natural?" Great idea," Babbitt admired. Not for 14 years had he taken a holiday without his wife, and neither of them quite believed they could commit this audacity. Many members of the athletic club did go camping without their wives, but they were officially dedicated to fishing and hunting, whereas the sacred and unchangeable sports of Babbitt and Paul Riesling were golfing, motoring, and bridge. For either the fishermen or the golfers to have changed their habits would have been an infraction of their self-imposed discipline, which would have shocked all right-thinking and regularized citizens. Babbitt blustered, "Why don't we just put our foot down and say, 'We're going ahead of you,' and that's all there is to it. Nothing criminal in it. Simply say to Zilla—" "Don't say anything to Zilla simply. Why, Georgie, she's almost as much of a moralist as you are, and if I told her the truth, she'd believe we were going to meet some dames in New York. And even Myra, she never nags you the way Zilla does, but she'd worry. She'd say, 'Don't you want me to go to Maine with you? I shouldn't dream of going unless you wanted me.' And you'd give in to save her feelings. Oh, the devil! Let's have a shot at duck-pins." During the game of duck-pins, a juvenile form of bowling, Paul was silent. As they came down the steps of the club, not more than half an hour after the time at which Babbitt had sternly told Miss McGowan he would be back, Paul sighed, "Look here, old man, oughtn't to talk about Zilla the way I did." "Rats, old man, lifts off steam." "Oh, I know, after spending all noon sneering at the conventional stuff. I'm conventional enough to be ashamed of saving my life by busting out with my fool troubles." "Oh, Paul, your nerves are kind of on the bum. I'm going to take you away. I'm going to rig this thing. I'm going to have an important deal in New York, and sure, of course, I'll need you to advise me on the roof of the building, and the old deal will fall through, and there'll be nothing for us but to go on ahead to Maine. Paul, when it comes right down to it, I don't care whether you bust loose or not. I do like having a rep for being one of the bunch, but if you ever need me, I'd chuck it and come out for you every time. Not, of course, but what you're, of course, I don't mean you'd ever do anything that would put a decent position on the fritz, but see what I mean? I'm kind of a clumsy old codger, and I need your fine Elysian hand. Oh, hell, I can't stand here gassing all day. On the job. So long. Don't take any wooden nickels, Paulibus. See you soon. So long."
End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis, Chapter 6. He forgot Paul Riesling in an afternoon of not unagreeable details. After a return to his office, which seemed to have staggered on without him, he drove a prospect out to view a four-flat tenement in the Linton district. He was inspired by the customer's admiration of the new cigar lighter. Thrice its novelty made him use it, and thrice he hurled half-smoked cigarettes from the car, protesting,
"I gotta quit smoking so blame much."
Their ample discussion of every detail of the cigar lighter led them to speak of electric flat-irons and bed-warmers. Babbitt apologized for being so shabbily old-fashioned as still to use a hot water bottle, and he announced that he would have the sleeping porch wired at once. He had enormous and poetic admiration, though very little understanding, of all mechanical devices. They were his symbols of truth and beauty. Regarding each new intricate mechanism, metal lathe, two-jet carburetor, machine gun, acetylene welder, he learned one good realistic-sounding phrase, and used it over and over with a delightful feeling of being technical and initiated. The customer joined him in the worship of machinery, and they came buoyantly up to the tenement and began that examination of plastic slate roof, calamine doors, and 7/8-inch blind-nailed flooring. Began those diplomacies of hurt surprise and readiness to be persuaded to do something they had already decided to do, which would some day result in a sale. On the way back, Babbitt picked up his partner and father-in-law, Henry T. Thompson, at his kitchen cabinet works, and they drove through South Zenith, a high-colored, banging, exciting region, new factories of Valhalla tile with gigantic wire-glass windows, surly old red-brick factories stained with tar, high-perched water tanks, big red trucks like locomotives, and on a score of hectic side-tracks, far-wandering freight cars from the New York Central and apple orchards, the Great Northern and wheat plateaus, the Southern Pacific, and orange groves. They talked to the secretary of the Zenith Foundry Company about an interesting artistic project, a cast-iron fence for Linden Lane Cemetery. They drove on to the Zeeco Motor Company and interviewed the sales manager, Noel Ryland, about a discount on a Zeeco car for Thompson. Babbitt and Royland were fellow members of the Boosters Club, and no booster felt right if he bought anything from another booster without receiving a discount. But Henry Thompson growled,
"Oh, to hell with them. I'm not going to crawl around mooching discounts, not from nobody."
It was one of the differences between Thompson, the old-fashioned, lean Yankee, rugged, traditional stage type of American business man, and Babbitt, the plump, smooth, efficient, up-to-the-minute, and otherwise perfected modern. Whenever Thompson twanged, "Put your John Hancock on that line," Babbitt was as much amused by the antiquated provincialism as any proper Englishman by any American. He knew himself to be of a breeding altogether more aesthetic and sensitive than Thompson's. He was a college graduate. He played golf. He often smoked cigarettes instead of cigars, and when he went to Chicago he took a room with a private bath. "The whole thing is," he explained to Paul Riesling, "these old codgers lack the subtlety that you have to have today." This advance in civilization could be carried too far, Babbitt perceived. Noel Ryland, sales manager of the Zeeco, was a frivolous graduate of Princeton, while Babbitt was a sound and standard wearer from the great department store, the State University. Ryland wore spats. He wrote long letters about city planning and community singing, and though he was a booster, he was known to carry in his pockets small volumes of poetry in a foreign language. All this was going too far. Henry Thompson was the extreme of insularity, and Noel Ryland the extreme of frothiness, while between them, supporting the state, defending the evangelical churches, and domestic brightness and sound business, were Babbitt and his friends. With this just estimate of himself, and with the promise of a discount on Thompson's car, he returned to his office in triumph. But as he went through the corridor of the Reeves Building, he sighed, "Poor old Paul. I got to Oh, damn Noel Ryland, damn Charlie McKivney. Just because they make more money than I do, they think they're so superior. I wouldn't be found dead in their stuffy old Union Club. Somehow, today, I don't feel like going back to work. Oh, well." 2. He answered telephone calls. He read the 4 o'clock mail. He signed his morning's letters. He talked to a tenant about repairs. He fought with Stanley Graff. Young Graff, the outside salesman, was always hinting that he deserved an increase of commission, and today he complained, "I think I ought to get a bonus if I put through the Healer sale. I'm chasing around and working on it every single evening, almost." Babbitt frequently remarked to his wife that it was better to con your office help along and keep 'em happy, instead of jumping on 'em and poking 'em up. Get more work out of 'em that way. But this unexampled lack of appreciation hurt him, and he turned on Graff. "Look here, Stan, let's get this clear. You've got an idea somehow that it's you that do all the selling. Where'd you get that stuff? Where'd you think you'd be if it wasn't for our capital behind you, and our lists of properties, and all the prospects we find for you? All you got to do is follow up our tips and close the deal. The hall porter could sell Babbitt Thompson listings. You say you're engaged to a girl, but have to put in your evenings chasing for buyers. Well, why the devil shouldn't you? What do you want to do? Sit around holding her hand? Let me tell you, Stan, if your girl is worth her salt, she'll be glad to know you're out hustling, making some money to furnish the home nest instead of doing the lovey-dovey. The kind of fellow that kicks about working overtime, that wants to spend his evenings reading trashy novels or spooning and exchanging a lot of nonsense and foolishness with some girl, he ain't the kind of upstanding, energetic young man with a future and with vision that we want here. How about it? What's your ideal, anyway? Do you want to make money and be a responsible member of the community, or do you want to be a loafer with no inspiration or pep?" Graff was not so amiable to vision and ideals as usual. "You bet I want to make money. That's why I want that bonus. Honest, Mr. Babbitt, I don't want to get fresh, but this Heller house is a terror. Nobody'll fall for it. The flooring is rotten and the walls are full of cracks." "That's exactly what I mean. To a salesman with a love for his profession, it's hard problems like that that inspire him to do his best. Besides, Stan, matter of fact, Thompson and I are against bonuses as a matter of principle. We like you, and we want to help you so you can get married, but we can't be unfair to the others on the staff. If we start giving you bonuses, don't you see we're going to hurt the feelings and be unjust to Penniman and Laylock? Right's right, and discrimination is unfair, and there ain't going to be any of it in this office. Don't get the idea, Stan, that because during the war salesmen were hard to hire, now when there's a lot of men out of work, there aren't a slew of bright young fellows that would be glad to step in and enjoy your opportunities and not act as if Thompson and I were his enemies and not do any work except for bonuses. How about it, eh? How about it?" "Oh, well, gee, of course," sighed Graff as he went out, crabwise. Babbitt did not often squabble with his employees. He liked to like the people about him. He was dismayed when they did not like him. It was only when they attacked the sacred purse that he was frightened into a fury. But then, being a man given to oratory and high principles, he enjoyed the sound of his own vocabulary and the warmth of his own virtue. Today he had so passionately indulged in self-approval that he wondered whether he had been entirely just.
After all, Stan isn't a boy any more. Oughtn't to call him so hard. But rats, got to haul folks over the coals now and then for their own good. Unpleasant duty, but I wonder if Stan is sore. What's he saying to McGowan out there?"
So chill a wind of hatred blew from the outer office that the normal comfort of his evening home-going was ruined. He was distressed by losing that approval of his employees to which an executive is always slave. Ordinarily he left the office with 1,000 enjoyable fussy directions to the effect that there would undoubtedly be important tasks tomorrow, and Miss McGowan and Miss Bannigan would do well to be there early, and for heaven's sake remind him to call up Cornell Lighty soon as he came in. Tonight he departed with feigned and apologetic liveliness. He was as afraid of his still-faced clerks, of the eyes focused on him. Miss McGowan staring with head lifted from her typing, Miss Bannigan looking over her ledger, Matt Penniman craning around at his desk in the dark alcove, Stanley Graff sullenly expressionless as a parvenu before the bleak promontory of his butler. He hated to expose his back to their laughter, and in his efforts to be casually merry he stammered and was raucously friendly and oozed wretchedly out the door. But he forgot his misery when he saw from Smith Street the charms of Floral Heights, the roofs of red tile and green slate, the shining new sun parlors, and the stainless walls. 3. He stopped to inform Howard Littlefield, his scholarly neighbor, that though the day had been springlike, the evening might be cold. He went in to shout, "Where are you?" at his wife, with no very definite desire to know where she was. He examined the lawn to see whether the furnace man had raked it properly. With some satisfaction and a good deal of discussion of the matter with Mrs. Babbitt, Ted, and Howard Littlefield, he concluded that the furnace man had not raked it properly. He cut 2 tufts of wild grass with his wife's largest dressmaking scissors. He informed Ted that it was all nonsense having a furnace man.
"Big husky fellow like you ought to do all the work around the house."
And privately he meditated that it was agreeable to have it known throughout the neighborhood that he was so prosperous that his son never worked around the house. He stood on the sleeping porch and did his day's exercises, arms out sideways for 2 minutes, up for 2 minutes, while he muttered, "Ought to take more exercise, keep in shape." Then went in to see whether his collar needed changing before dinner. As usual, it apparently did not. The Lettish Croat maid, a powerful woman, beat the dinner gong. The roast beef, roasted potatoes, and string beans were excellent this evening, and after an adequate sketch of the day's progressive weather states, his $450 fee, his lunch with Paul Riesling, and the proven merits of the new cigar lighter, he was moved to a benign,
"Sort of thinking about buying a new car. Don't believe we'll get one till next year, but still we might."
Verona, the older daughter, cried, "Oh, Dad, if you do, why don't you get a sedan? That would be perfectly slick. A closed car is so much more comfy than an open one."
"Well, now, I don't know about that. I kind of like an open car. You get more fresh air that way."
"Oh, shoot. Just because you've never tried a sedan. Let's get one. It's got a lot more class," said Ted. "A closed car does keep the clothes nicer," from Mrs. Babbitt. "You don't get your hair all blown to pieces," from Verona. "It's a lot sportier," from Ted. And from Tinka the youngest, "Oh, let's have a sedan. Mary Ellen's father has got one." Ted wound up, "Oh, everybody's got a closed car now, except us." Babbitt faced them.
"I guess you got nothing very terrible to complain about, anyway. I don't keep a car just to enable you children to look like millionaires, and I like an open car, so you can put the top down on summer evenings and go out for a drive and get some good fresh air. Besides, closed car costs more money."
Gee whiz, if the Delapadors can afford a closed car, I guess we can," prodded Ted.
"Huh. I make 8,000 a year to his 7, but I don't blow it all in and waste it and throw it around the way he does. Don't believe in this business of going and spending a whole lot of money to show off and—" They went with ardor and some thoroughness into the matters of streamlined bodies, hill-climbing power, wire wheels, chrome steel, ignition systems, and body colors. It was much more than a study of transportation. It was an aspiration for knightly rank. In the city of Zenith, in the barbarous 20th century, a family motor indicated its social rank as precisely as the grades of the prairies determined the rank of an English family. Indeed, more precisely. Considering the opinion of old country families upon newly created brewery barons and woolen mill viscounts, the details of precedence were never officially determined. There was no court to decide whether the second son of a Pierce Arrow limousine should go for dinner before the first son of a Buick Roadster. But of the respective social importance there was no doubt, and where Babbitt as a boy had aspired to the presidency, his son aspired to a Packard Twin Six and an established position in the motor gentry. The favor which Babbitt had won from his family by speaking of a new car evaporated as they realized he didn't intend to buy one this year. Ted lamented, "Oh, punk! The old boat looks as if it had fleas and been scratching its varnish off." Mrs. Babbitt said abstractedly, "It's no way to talk to your father." Babbitt raged, "If you're too much of a high-class gentleman and you belong to the Bon Ton and so on, why, you needn't take the car out this evening." Ted explained, I didn't mean," and dinner dragged on with normal domestic delight to the inevitable point at which Babbitt protested, Come now, we can't sit here all evening. Give the girl a chance to clear away the table." He was fretting, "What a family! I don't know how we all get to scrapping this way. Like to go off some place and be able to hear myself think. Paul, Maine, wear old pants and loaf and cuss." He said cautiously to his wife, "I've been in correspondence with a man in New York. Wants me to see him about a real estate trade. May not come off till summer. Hope it doesn't break just when we and the Riesling get together to go to Maine. Be a shame if we couldn't make the trip there together. Well, no use worrying now." Verona escaped immediately after dinner with no discussion save an automatic, "Why don't you ever stay home?" from Babbitt. In the living room in a corner of the Davenport, Ted settled down to his home study, plane geometry, Cicero, and the agonizing metaphors of Comus. "I don't see why they give us this old-fashioned junk by Milton and Shakespeare and Wordsworth and all these has-beens," he protested. "Oh, I guess I could stand to see a show by Shakespeare if they had swell scenery and put on a lot of dog, but to sit down in cold blood and read 'em! These teachers, how do they get that way?" Mrs. Babbitt, darning socks, speculated, "Yes, I wonder why. Of course I don't want to fly in the face of the professors and everybody, but I do think there's things in Shakespeare. Not that I read him much, but when I was young the girls used to show me passages that weren't at all nice." Babbitt looked up irritably from the comic strips in the Evening Advocate. They composed his favorite literature and art, these illustrated chronicles in which Mr. Mutt hit Mr. Jeff with a rotten egg, and Mother corrected Father's vulgarisms by means of a rolling pin. With the solemn face of a devotee breathing heavily through his open mouth, he plodded nightly through every picture, and during the rite he detested interruptions. Furthermore, he felt that on the subject of Shakespeare he wasn't really an authority. Neither the Advocate-Times, the Evening Advocate, nor the Bulletin of the Zenith Chamber of Commerce had ever had an editorial on the matter, and until one of them had spoken he found it hard to form an original opinion. But even at risk of floundering in strange bogs, he could not keep out of an open controversy. "I'll tell you why you have to study Shakespeare and those. It's because they're required for college entrance, and that's all there is to it. Personally, I don't see myself why they stuck 'em into an up-to-date high school system like we have here in this state. Be a good deal better if you took business English and learned how to write an ad, or letters that would pull. But there it is, and there's no tall argument or discussion about it. Trouble with you, Ted, is you always want to do something different. If you're going to law school, and you are, I never had a chance to, but I'll see that you do. Why, you'll want to lay in all the English and Latin you can get."
"Oh, Punk, I don't see what's the use of law school, nor even finishing high school. I don't want to go to college, specially. Honest, there's a lot of fellows that have graduated from colleges that don't even begin to make as much money as the fellows that went to work early. Old Shimmy Peters, that teaches Latin in the high, he's a what is it from Columbia, and he sits up all night reading a lot of greasy books, and he's always spieling about the value of languages. And the poor soak doesn't even make but 1,800 a year, and no traveling salesman would think of working for that. I know what I'd like to do. I'd like to be an aviator, or own a corking big garage, or else a fellow was telling me about it yesterday. I'd like to be one of those fellows that the Standard Oil Company sends out to China, and you live in a compound, and you don't have to do any work, and you get to see the world, and pagodas, and the ocean, and everything. And then I could take up correspondence courses. That's real stuff. You don't have to recite to some frosty-faced old dame that's trying to show off to the principal, and you can study any subject you want to. Just listen to this. I clipped these ads of some swell courses." He snatched from the back of his geometry 100 advertisements of those home study courses which the energy and foresight of American commerce have contributed to the science of education. The first displayed the portrait of a young man with a pure brow, an iron jaw, silk socks, and hair like patent leather, standing with one hand in his trousers pocket and the other extended with chiding forefinger. He was bewitching an audience of men with gray beard, paunches, bald heads, and every other sign of wisdom and prosperity. Above the picture was an inspiring educational symbol. No antiquated lamp or torch or owl or Minerva, but a row of dollar signs. The text ran, "Power and Prosperity and Public Speaking. A Yarn Told at the Club." Who do you think I ran into the other evening at the Deluxe restaurant? Why, old Freddie Durkee, that used to be a dead or alive shipping clerk in my old place. Mr. Mouseman, we used to laughingly call the dear fellow. One time he was so timid he was plumb scared of the super, and never got credit for the dandy work he did. Him at the Deluxe, and if he wasn't ordering a Tony feed, with all the fixin' from celery to nuts, and instead of being embarrassed by the waiters like he used to be at the little dump where we lunched in old Lang Syne, he was bossing them around like he was a millionaire. I cautiously asked him what he was doing. Freddie laughed and said, "Say, old chum, I guess you're wondering what's come over me. You'll be glad to know I am now an assistant super at the old shop, and right on high road to prosperity and domination. And I look forward with confidence to a 12-cylinder car, and the wife is making things hum in the best society, and the kiddies getting a first-class education. What we teach you: how to address your lodge, how to give toasts, how to tell dialect stories, how to propose to a lady, how to entertain banquets, how to make convincing selling talks, how to build a big vocabulary, how to create a strong personality, how to become a rational, powerful, and original thinker, how to be a master man. Prof. W. F. Peet, author of the Shortcut Course in Public Speaking, is easily the foremost figure in practical literature, psychology, and oratory, a graduate of some of our leading universities, lecturer, extensive traveler, author of books, poetry, etc., a man with the unique personality of the master minds. He is ready to give you all the secrets of his culture and hammering force in a few easy lessons that will not interfere with other occupations. Here's how it happened. I ran across an ad of a course that claimed to teach people how to talk easily on their feet and to answer complaints, how to lay a proposition before the boss, how to hit a bank for a loan, how to hold a big audience spellbound with wit, humor, aniseed, inspiration, etc. It was compiled by the master orator, Professor Waldo F. Peet. I was skeptical, too, but I wrote, just on a postcard, with name and address, to the publisher for the lessons. Sent on trial. Money back if you're not absolutely satisfied. There were 8 simple lessons in plain language anybody could understand, and I studied them just a few hours a night, then started practicing on the wife. Soon found I could talk right up to the super, and get due credit for all the good work I did. They began to appreciate me and advance me fast, and say, "Old doggo, what do you think they're paying me now? $6,500 per year. And say, I find I can keep a big audience fascinated, speaking on any topic. As a friend, old boy, I advise you to send for circular, no obligation, and valuable free art picture to Shortcut Educational Publishing Company, Desk WA, Sand Pit, Iowa. Are you a 100%er or a 10%er?" Babbitt was again without a canon which would enable him to speak with authority. Nothing in motoring or real estate had indicated what a solid citizen and regular fellow ought to think about culture by mail. He began with hesitation. "Well, sounds as if it covered the ground. Certainly is a fine thing to be able to orate. I sometimes thought I had a little talent that way myself. And I know darn well that one reason why a four-flushing old back number like Chan Mott can get away with it in real estate is just because he can make a good talk, even when he hasn't got a doggone thing to say. And it certainly is pretty cute the way they get out all those courses on various topics and subjects nowadays. I'll tell you, though, no need to blow a lot of good money on this stuff when you can get a first-rate course in eloquence and English and all that right now in your own school, and one of the biggest school buildings in the entire country." "That's so," said Mrs. Babbitt comfortably, while Ted complained, "Yeah, but Dad, they just teach a lot of old junk that isn't any practical use except the manual training and typewriting and basketball and dancing, and in these correspondence courses, gee, you can get all kinds of stuff that would come in handy. Say, listen to this one. Can you play a man's part? If you are walking with your mother, sister, or best girl, and someone passes a slighting remark or uses improper language, won't you be ashamed if you can't take her part? Well, can you? We teach boxing and self-defense by mail. Many pupils have written saying that after a few lessons they've outboxed bigger and heavier opponents. The lessons start with simple movements practiced before your mirror, holding out your hand for a coin, the breaststroke in swimming, etc. Before you realize it, you are striking scientifically, ducking, guarding, and feigning, just as if you had a real opponent before you. Oh, baby! Maybe I wouldn't like that," Ted chanted. "I'll tell the world. Gosh, I'd like to take one fellow I know in school that's always shooting off his mouth and catch him alone." "Nonsense! The idea! Most useless thing I ever heard of!" Babbitt fulminated. "Well, just suppose I was walking with Mama or Rone, and somebody passed a slighting remark or used improper language. What would I do?"
"Why, you'd probably bust the record for the 100-yard dash."
"I would not. I'd stand right up to any mucker that passed a slighting remark on my sister, and I'd show him."
"Look here, young Dempsey, if I ever catch you fighting, I'll whale the everlasting daylights out of you, and I'll do it without practicing holding out my hand for a coin before a mirror, too."
"Why, Ted, dear," Mrs. Babbitt said placidly, "it's not at all nice you're talking of fighting this way." "Well, gosh almighty, that's a fine way to appreciate. And then suppose I was walking with you, Ma, and somebody passed a slighting remark."
"Nobody's going to pass no slighting remarks on nobody," Babbitt observed. "Not if they stay home and study their geometry and mind their own affairs, instead of hanging out around a lot of pool rooms and soda fountains and places where nobody's got any business to be."
"But, gosh, Dad, if they did," Mrs. Babbitt chirped. "Well, if they did, I wouldn't do them the honor of paying any attention to them. Besides, they never do. You always hear about these women that get followed and insulted and all, but I don't believe a word of it. Or it's their own fault, the way some women look at a person. I certainly never have been insulted by— Oh, shoot, Mother, just suppose you were, sometime. Just suppose. Can't you suppose something? Can't you imagine things? Certainly I can imagine things. The idea.
Certainly Mother can imagine things and suppose things. Think you're the only member of this household that's got imagination? Babbitt demanded. But what's the use of a lot of supposing? Supposing never gets you anywhere. No sense supposing when there's a lot of real facts to take into consider.
Look here, Dad. Suppose, just suppose you were in your office and some rival real estate man—
Realtor?
Some realtor you hated came in.
I don't hate any realtor.
But suppose you did.
I don't intend to suppose anything of the kind. There's plenty of fellows in my profession that stoop and hate their competitors. But if you were a little older and understood business, instead of always going on to the movies and running around with a lot of fool girls with their dresses up to their knees and powdered and painted and rouged and God knows what all, as if they were chorus girls, then you'd know, and you'd suppose that if there's any one thing I stand for in the real estate circles of Zenith, it is that we ought to always speak of each other only in the friendliest terms and institute a spirit of brotherhood and cooperation. And so I certainly can't suppose, and I can't imagine my hating any other realtor, not even that dirty four-flushing society sneak, Cecil Roundtree.
But—
And there's no if, and, or but about it. But if I were going to lambaste somebody, I wouldn't require any fancy ducks or swimming strokes before a mirror, or any of these doodads and flip-flops. Suppose you were out some place and a fellow called you vile names. Think you'd want to box and jump around like a dancing master? You'd just lay him out cold. Least I certainly hope any son of mine would. And then you'd dust off your hands and go on about your business. And that's all there is to it. And you aren't going to have any boxing lessons by mail either.
Well, but yes, I just wanted to show how many different kinds of correspondence courses there are instead of all that camembert they teach us in the high.
But I thought they taught you boxing in the school gymnasium.
That's different. They stick you up and some big stiff amuses himself pounding the stuffings out of you before you have a chance to learn. Not any, but anyway, listen to some of these others.
The advertisements were truly philanthropic. One of them bore the rousing headline, Money, Money, Money. The second announced that Mr. P.R., formerly making only $18 a week in a barber shop, writes to us that since taking our course, he is now pulling down $5,000 as an osteovitalic physician. And the third that Miss J.L., recently a wrapper in a store, is now getting $10 real dollars a day, teaching our Hindu system of vibratory breathing and mental control. Ted had collected 50 or 60 announcements from annual reference books, from Sunday school periodicals, fiction magazines, and journals of discussion. One benefactor implored, "Don't be a wallflower. Be more popular and make more money. You can ukulele or sing yourself into society by the secret principles of a newly discovered system of music teaching. Anyone, man, lady, or child, can, without tiresome exercises, special training, or long drawn-out study, and without waste of time, money, or energy, learn to play by note, piano, banjo, cornet, clarinet, saxophone, violin, or drum, and learn sight singing." The next, under the wistful appeal, "Fingerprint detectives wanted. Big incomes." Confided, "You red-blooded men and women, this is the profession you have been looking for. There's money in it. Big money." And that rapid change of scene, that entrancing and compelling interest and fascination which your active mind and adventure spirit crave. Think of being the chief figure and directing factor in solving strange mysteries and baffling crimes. This wonderful profession brings you into contact with influential men on the basis of equality, and often calls upon you to travel everywhere, maybe to distant lands, all expenses paid, no special education required. Oh, boy, I guess that wins a fire-brick necklace. Wouldn't it be swell to travel everywhere and nab some famous crook? Whoop, Ted. Well, I don't think much of that. Doggone likely to get hurt. Still, that music study stunt might be pretty fair, though. There's no reason why, if efficiency experts put their minds to it the way they have to routing products in a factory, they couldn't figure out some scheme so a person wouldn't have to monkey with all this practicing and exercising that get in music. Babbitt was impressed, and he had a delightful parental feeling that they two, the men of the family, understood each other. He listened to the notices of mailbox universities which taught short story writing, improving the memory, motion picture acting, and developing the soul power, banking and Spanish, chiropody and photography, electrical engineering and window trimming, poultry raising and chemistry.
Well, well, Babbitt sought for adequate expression of his admiration. I'm a son of a gun. I know this correspondence school business had become a mighty profitable game. Makes suburban real estate look like 2 cents. But I didn't realize it had got to be such a key industry. Must rank right up there with groceries and movies. Always figured somebody'd come along with the brains not to leave education to a lot of bookworms and impractical theorists, but make a big thing out of it. Yes, I can see how a lot of those courses might interest you. I must ask the fellows at athletics if they ever realized. But same time, Ted, you know how some advertisers exaggerate. I don't know as they'd be able to jam you through those courses as fast as they claim they can."
"Oh, sure, Dad, of course."
Ted had the immense and joyful maturity of a boy who is respectfully listened to by his elders. Babbitt concentrated on him with grateful affection.
"I can see what an influence these courses might have on the whole educational works. Of course, I'd never admit it publicly. Fellow like myself, a State U graduate. It's only decent and patriotic for him to blow his horn and boost an alma mater. But smarter of fact, there's a whole lot of valuable time lost even at the U, studying poetry and French and subjects that never brought in anybody a cent. I don't know but what maybe these correspondence courses might prove to be one of the most important American inventions. Trouble with a lot of folks, they're so blame material, they don't see the spiritual and mental side of American supremacy. They think that inventions like the telephone and the airplane and wireless, no, that was a wop invention, but anyway, they think these mechanical improvements are all that we stand for, whereas to a real thinker, he sees that spiritual and dominating movements like efficiency and Rotarianism and prohibition and democracy are what compose our deepest and truest wealth. And maybe this new principle in education at home may be another factor. I'll tell you, Ted, we've got to have vision."
"I think those correspondence courses are terrible." The philosophers gasped. It was Mrs. Babbitt who had made this discord in their spiritual harmony. And one of Miss Babbitt's virtues was that, except during dinner parties, when she was transformed into a raging hostess, she took care of the house and didn't bother the males by thinking. She went on firmly, "It sounds awful to me, the way they coax these poor young folks to think they're learning something, and nobody round to help them, and you two learn so quick. But me, I always was slow, but just the same."
Babbitt attended to her. "Nonsense! Get just as much studying at home. You don't think a fellow learns any more because he blows in his father's hard-earned money and sits around in Morris chairs in a swell Harvard dormitory with pictures and shields and table covers and those doodads, do you? I tell you, I'm a college man, I know. There's one objection you might make, though. I certainly do protest against any effort to get a lot of fellows out of barber shops and factories into the professions. They're too crowded already. And what'll we do for workmen if all those fellows go and get educated?"
Ted was leaning back, smoking a cigarette without reproof. He was, for the moment, sharing the high, thin air of Babbitt's speculation as though he were a Paul Riesling or even Dr. Howard Littlefield. He hinted, "Well, what do you think, then, Dad? Wouldn't it be a good idea if I could go off to China or some peppy place and study engineering or something by mail?"
"No, and I'll tell you why, son. I've found out it's a mighty nice thing to be able to say you're a B.A. Some client that doesn't know what you are and thinks you're just a plug businessman, he gets to shooting off his mouth about economics or literature or foreign trade conditions, and you just ease in something like, 'When I was in college, of course I got my B.A. in sociology and all that junk.' Oh, it puts an awful crimp in their style. But there wouldn't be any class to saying, I got the degree of sticker licker from Benzos Mail Order University. You see, my dad was a pretty good old coot, but he never had much style to him, and I had to work darn hard to earn my way through college. Well, it's been worth it, to be able to associate with the finest gentlemen in Zenith at the clubs and so on. And I wouldn't want you to drop out of the gentleman class, the class that are just as red-blooded as common people, but still have power and personality. It would kind of hurt me if you did that, old man."
I know, Dad. Sure. All right. I'll stick to it. Say, gosh, gee whiz. I forgot all about those kids I was going to take to the chorus rehearsal. I'll have to duck.
"But you haven't done your homework."
Do it first thing in the morning.
"Well."
6 times in the past 60 days, Babbitt had stormed,
"You will not do it first thing in the morning. You'll do it right now."
but tonight he said,
"Well, better hustle."
his smile was the rare shy radiance he kept for Paul Riesling. 4.
"Ted's a good boy,"
he said to Miss Babbitt. Oh, he is.
"Who's these girls he's going to pick up? Are they nice, decent girls?"
I don't know. Oh, dear. Ted never tells me anything any more. I don't understand what's come over the children of this generation. I used to have to tell Papa and Mama everything, but it seems like the children today have just slipped away from all control.
"I hope they're decent girls. Of course, Ted's no longer a kid, and I wouldn't want him to get mixed up in everything."
George, I wonder if you hadn't ought to take him aside and tell him about things.
She blushed and lowered her eyes.
"Well, I don't know. Way I figure it, Myra, no sense suggesting a lot of things to a boy's mind. Think up enough devilment by himself, but I wonder. It's kind of a hard question. Wonder what Littlefield thinks about it."
Of course Papa agrees with you. He says all this instruction is, he says 'tisn't decent.
"Oh, he does he? Well, let me tell you that whatever Henry T. Thompson thinks about morals, I mean, though of course you can't beat the old duffer."
Why, what a way to talk of Papa.
"Simply can't beat him at getting in on the ground floor of a deal. But let me tell you, whenever he springs any ideas about higher things and education, then I think just the opposite. You may not regard me as any great brain shark, but believe me, I'm a regular college president compared to Henry T. Yes, sir, by golly, I'm going to take Ted aside and tell him why I lead a strictly moral life."
Oh, will you? When?
When? What's the use of trying to pin me down to when and why and where and how and when? That's the trouble with women. That's why they don't make a high-class executives. They haven't any sense of diplomacy. When the proper opportunity and occasion arises, so it just comes in natural, why, then I'll have a friendly little talk with him and... Was that Tinka hollering upstairs? She ought to be asleep long ago."
He prowled through the living room and stood in the sun parlor, that glass-walled room of wicker chairs and swinging couch in which they loafed on Sunday afternoons. Outside, only the light of Doppelbrau's house and the dim presence of Babbitt's favorite elm broke the softness of April night.
"Good business with the boy. Getting over feeling cranky the way I did this morning, and restless. Though, by golly, I will have a few days alone with Paul in Maine, and that devil Zilla. But Ted's all right. Whole family's all right. And good business. Now many fellows make $450, practically half of $1,000 easy as I did today. Maybe when we all get to rowing, it's just as much my fault as it is theirs. Oughtn't to get grouchy like I do, but wish I'd been a pioneer, same as my granddad. But then wouldn't have a house like this. Oh, gosh, I don't know."
He thought moodily of Paul Riesling, of their youth together, of the girls they had known. When Babbitt had graduated from the State University 24 years ago, he had intended to be a lawyer. He had been a ponderous debater in college. He felt that he was an orator. He saw himself becoming governor of the state. While he read law, he worked as a real estate salesman. He saved money, lived in a boarding house, supped on poached egg and hash. The lively Paul Riesling, who was going off to Europe to study violin next month or next year, was his refuge till Paul was bespelled by Zilla Colbeck,
who laughed and danced and drew men after her plump and gaily wagging finger. Babbitt's evenings were barren then, and he found comfort only in Paul's second cousin, Myra Thompson, a sleek and gentle girl who showed her capacity by agreeing with the ardent young Babbitt that of course he was going to be governor some day. Where Zilla mocked him as a country boy, Myra said indignantly that he was ever so much soldier than the young dandies who had been born in the great city of Zenith, an ancient settlement in 1897, 105 years old, with 200,000 population, the queen and wonder of all the state, and to the Catawba boy, George Babbitt, so vast and thunderous and luxurious that he was flattered to know a girl ennobled by birth in Zenith. Of love there was no talk between them. He knew that if he was to study law he could not marry for years, and Myra was distinctly a nice girl. One didn't kiss her, one didn't think about her that way at all, unless one was going to marry her. But she was a dependable companion. She was always ready to go skating, walking, always content to hear his discourses on the great things he was going to do, the distressed poor whom he would defend against the unjust rich, the speeches he would make at banquets, the inexactitudes of popular thought which he would correct. One evening, when he was weary and soft-minded, he saw that she had been weeping. She had been left out of a party given by Zilla. Somehow her head was on his shoulder, and he was kissing away her tears, and she raised her head to say trustingly, "Now that we're engaged, shall we be married soon, or shall we wait?"
Engaged! It was his first hint of it. His affection for his brown, tender woman went cold and fearful, but he could not hurt her, could not abuse her trust. He mumbled something about waiting and escaped. He walked for an hour, trying to find a way of telling her that it was a mistake. Often in the month after, he got near to telling her, but it was pleasant to have a girl in his arms, and less could he insult her by blurting out that he didn't love her. He himself had no doubt. The evening before his marriage was an agony, and the morning wild with the desire to flee. She made him what is known as a good wife. She was loyal, industrious, and at rare times merry. She passed from a feeble disgust at their closer relations into what promised to be an ardent affection, but it drooped into bored routine. Yet she existed only for him and for the children, and she was as sorry, as worried as himself when he gave up the law and trudged on in a rut of listing real estate. Poor kid, she hasn't had much better time than I have, Babbitt reflected, standing in the dark sun-parlor. But I wish I could have had a whirl at law and politics, seen what I could do. Well, maybe I've made more money as it is.
He returned to the living room, but before he settled down, he smoothed his wife's hair. She glanced up, happy and somewhat surprised. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 7. Part 1. He solemnly finished the last copy of the American magazine while his wife sighed, laid away her darning, and looked enviously at the lingerie designs in a woman's magazine. The room was very still. It was a room which observed the best Floral Heights standards. The gray walls were divided into artificial paneling by strips of white enameled pine. From the Babbitts' former house had come two much carved rocking chairs, but the other chairs were new, very deep and restful, upholstered in blue and gold striped velvet. A blue velvet davenport faced the fireplace, and behind it was a cherrywood table and a tall piano lamp with a shade of golden silk. 2 out of every 3 houses in Floral Heights had before the fireplace a davenport, a mahogany table, real or imitation, and a piano lamp or reading lamp with a shade of yellow or rose silk. On the table was a runner of gold-threaded Chinese fabric, 4 magazines, a silver box containing cigarette crumbs, and 3 gift books, large, expensive editions of fairy tales illustrated by English artists, and as yet unread by any Babbitt save Tinka. In a corner by the front windows was a large cabinet Victrola. 8 out of every 9 Floral Heights houses had a cabinet phonograph. Among the pictures, hung in the exact center of each gray panel, were a red and black imitation English hunting print, an anemic imitation boudoir print, with a French caption of whose morality Babbitt had always been rather suspicious, and a hand-colored photograph of a colonial room, rag rug, maiden spinning, cat demure before a white fireplace. 19 out of every 20 houses in Floral Heights had either a hunting print, a Madame fait la toilette print, a colored photograph of a New England house, a photograph of a Rocky Mountain, or all 4. It was a room as superior in comfort to the parlor of Babbitt's boyhood as his motor was superior to his father's buggy. Though there was nothing in the room that was interesting, there was nothing that was offensive. It was as neat and as negative as a block of artificial ice. The fireplace was unsoftened by downy ashes or sooty brick. The brass fire-irons were of immaculate polish, and the grenadier andirons were like samples in a shop, desolate, unwanted, lifeless things of commerce. Against the wall was a piano, with another piano lamp, but no one used it save Tinka. The hard briskness of the phonograph contented them. Their store of jazz records made them feel wealthy and cultured, and all they knew of creating music was the nice adjustment of a bamboo needle. The books on the table were unspotted and laid in rigid parallels. Not one corner of the carpet rug was curled, and nowhere was there a hockey stick, a torn picture book, an old cap, or a gregarious and disorganizing dog. 2. At home, Babbitt never read with absorption. He was concentrated enough at the office, but here he crossed his legs and fidgeted. When his story was interesting, he read the best. That was the funniest paragraphs to his wife. When it did not hold him, he coughed, scratched his ankles and his right ear, thrust his left thumb into his vest pocket, jingled his silver, whirled the cigar-cutter and keys on one end of his watch-chain, yawned, rubbed his nose, and found errands to do. He went upstairs to put on his slippers, his elegant slippers of seal brown, shaped like medieval shoes. He brought up an apple from the barrel which stood by the trunk-closet in the basement. "Apple day keeps the doctor away," he enlightened Mrs. Babbitt, for quite the first time in 14 hours. "That's so." "An apple is nature's best regulator."
"Yes, it—"
"Trouble with women is they never have sense enough to form regular habits."
"Why?"
"Always nibbling and eating between meals."
"George!"
She looked up from her reading.
"Did you have a light lunch today, like you were going to? I did."
This malicious and unprovoked attack astounded him.
"Well, maybe it wasn't light as went to lunch with Paul and didn't have much chance to diet." "Oh, you needn't grin like a Chessy cat. If it wasn't for me watching out and keeping an eye on our diet, I'm the only member of this family that appreciates the value of oatmeal for breakfast.
She stooped over her story while he piously sliced and gulped down the apple, discoursing.
"One thing I've done, cut down my smoking. Had kind of a run-in with Graff in the office. He's getting too darn fresh. I'll stand for a good deal, but once in a while I got to assert my authority, and I jumped him, Stan. I said, well, I told him just exactly where to get off. Funny kind of day. Makes me feel restless."
Well, the sleepiest sound in the world, the terminal yawn. Mrs. Babbitt yawned with it, and looked graceful as he droned,
"How about going to bed, eh? Don't suppose Rone and Ted will be in till all hours. Yep, funny kind of day. Not terribly warm, but yet, gosh, I'd like someday I'm going to take a long motor trip."
"Yes, we'd enjoy that," she yawned. He looked away from her as he realized that he did not wish to have her go with him. As he locked the doors and tried the windows, and set the heat regulator so that the furnace drafts would open automatically in the morning, he sighed a little heavily with the lonely feeling which perplexed and frightened him. So absent-minded was he that he could not remember which window catches he had inspected, and through the darkness, fumbling at unseen perilous chairs, he crept back to try them all over again. His feet were loud on the steps as he clumped up stairs at the end of his great and treacherous day of veiled rebellions. 3. Before breakfast he always reverted to upstate village boyhood, and shrank from the complex urban demands of shaving, bathing, deciding whether the current shirt was clean enough for another day. Whenever he stayed home in the evening, he went to bed early, and thriftily got ahead in those dismal duties. It was his luxurious custom to shave while sitting snugly in a tubful of hot water. He may be viewed to-night as a plump, smooth, pink, baldish, podgy, good man, robbed of the importance of spectacles, squatting in breast-high water, scraping his lather-smeared cheeks with a safety razor like a tiny lawn-mower, and with melancholy dignity clawing through the water to recover a slippery and active piece of soap. He was lulled to dreaming by the caressing warmth. The light fell on the inner surface of the tub in a pattern of delicate wrinkled lines which slipped with a green sparkle over the curving porcelain as the clear water trembled. Babbitt lazily watched it, noted that along the silhouette of his legs against the radiance on the bottom of the tub, the shadows of air bubbles clinging to the hairs were reproduced as strange jungle mosses. He patted the water, and reflected light capsized and leaped and volleyed. He was content and childish. He played. He shaved a swath down the calf of one plump leg. The drain pipe was dripping a dulcet and lively song. Drippity drip, dribble, drippity drip, drip. He was enchanted by it. He looked at the solid tub, the beautiful nickel tabs, the tiled walls of the room, and felt virtuous in the possession of this splendor. He roused himself and spoke gruffly to his bath things. "Come here. You've done enough fooling." He reproved the treacherous soap, and defied the scratchy nail-brush with, "Oh, you would you?" He soaped himself and rinsed himself, and austerely rubbed himself. He noted a hole in the Turkish towel, and meditatively thrust a finger through it, and marched back to the bedroom, a grave and unbending citizen. There was a moment of gorgeous abandon, a flash of melodrama such as he found in traffic driving, when he laid out a clean collar, discovered that it was frayed in front, and tore it up with magnificent ying sound. Most important of all was the preparation of his bed and the sleeping porch. It is not known whether he enjoyed his sleeping porch because of the fresh air, or because it was the standard thing to have a sleeping porch. Just as he was an Elk, a Booster, and a member of the Chamber of Commerce, just as the priests of the Presbyterian Church determined his every religious belief, and the senators who controlled the Republican party decided in little smoky rooms in Washington what he should think about disarmament, tariff, and Germany, so did the large national advertisers fix the surface of his life, fixed what he believed to be individuality. These standard advertised wares, toothpaste, socks, tires, cameras, instantaneous hot water heaters, were his symbols and proofs of excellence. At first the signs, then the substitutes for joy and passion and wisdom. But none of these advertised tokens of financial and social success was more significant than a sleeping porch with a sun parlor below. The rites of preparing for bed were elaborate and unchanging. The blankets had to be tucked in at the foot of his cot. Also, the reason why the maid hadn't tucked in the blankets had to be discussed with Mrs. Babbitt. The rag rug was adjusted so that his bare feet would strike it when he arose in the morning. The alarm clock was wound, the hot water bottle was filled and placed precisely 2 feet from the bottom of the cot. These tremendous undertakings yielded to his determination. One by one they were announced to Mrs. Babbitt, and smashed through to accomplishment. At last his brow cleared, and in his "Good night" rang virile power. But there was yet need of courage. As he sank into sleep, just at the first exquisite relaxation,
The Doppelbrau car came home. He bounced into wakefulness, lamenting, "Why the devil can't some people never get to bed at a reasonable hour?" So familiar was he with the process of putting up his own car that he awaited each step like an able executioner condemned to his own rack. The car insultingly cheerful in the driveway. The car door opened and banged shut. Then garage door slid open, grating on the sill, and the car door again. The motor raced for the climb up into the garage, and raced once more, explosively, before it was shut off. A final opening and slamming of the car door. Silence, then a horrible silence, filled with waiting, till the leisurely Mr. Doppelbrau had examined the state of his tires, and had at last shut the garage door. Instantly, for Babbitt, a blessed state of oblivion. For at that moment, in the city of Zenith, Horace Updike was making love to Lucille McKelvey in their mauve drawing-room on Royal Ridge, after the return from a lecture by the eminent English novelist. Updike was Zenith's professional bachelor, a slim-waisted man of 46, with an effeminate voice in taste in flowers, cretones, and flappers. Mrs. McKelvey was red-haired, creamy, discontented, exquisite, rude, and honest. Updike tried his invariable first maneuver, touching her nervous wrist. "Don't be an idiot," she said. "Do you mind awfully?" "No, that's what I mind." He changed to conversation. He was famous at conversation. He spoke reasonably of psychoanalysis, Long Island polo, and the Ming platter he had found in Vancouver. She promised to meet him in Deauville the coming summer, though she sighed, "It's becoming too dreadfully banal. Nothing but Americans and frowsy English baronesses." And at that moment in Zenith, a cocaine runner and a prostitute were drinking cocktails in Healey Hanson's saloon on Front Street. Since national prohibition was now in force, and since Zenith was notoriously law-abiding, they were compelled to keep cocktails innocent by drinking them out of teacups. The lady threw her cup at the cocaine runner's head. He worked his revolver out of the pocket in his sleeve and casually murdered her. At that moment in Zenith, two men sat in a laboratory. For 37 hours now they had been working on a report of their investigations of synthetic rubber. At that moment in Zenith there was a conference of 4 union officials as to whether the 12,000 coal miners within 100 miles of the city should strike. Of these men, one resembled a testy and prosperous grocer, one a Yankee carpenter, one a soda jerk, and one a Russian Jewish actor. The Russian Jew quoted Kautsky, Gene Debs, and Abraham Lincoln. At that moment a GAR veteran was dying. He had come from the Civil War straight to a farm, which, though it was officially within the city limits of Zenith, was primitive as the backwoods. He had never ridden in a motor car, never seen a bathtub, never read any book save the Bible, McGuffey's Readers, and religious tracts, and he believed that the earth is flat, that the English are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and that the United States is a democracy. At that moment the steel and cement town which composed the factory of the Pullmore Tractor Company of Zenith was running on night shift to fill an order of tractors for the Polish army. It hummed like a million bees, glared through its wide windows like a volcano. Along the high wire fences searchlights played on the cinder-lined yard, switch tracks and armed guards on patrol. At that moment Mike Monday was finishing a meeting. Mr. Monday, the distinguished evangelist, the best-known Protestant pontiff in America, had once been a prize-fighter. Satan had not dealt justly with him. As a prize-fighter he gained nothing but his crooked nose, his celebrated vocabulary, and his stage presence. The service of the Lord had been more profitable. He was about to retire with a fortune. It had been well earned, for, to quote his last report, Reverend Mr. Monday, the prophet with a punch, has shown that he is the world's greatest salesman of salvation, and that by efficient organization the overhead of spiritual regeneration may be kept down to an unprecedented rock-bottom basis. He has converted over 200,000 lost and priceless souls at an average cost of less than $10 a head.
Of the larger cities of the land, only Zenith had hesitated to submit its vices to Mike Monday and his expert reclamation corps. The more enterprising organizations of the city had voted to invite him. Mr. George F. Babbitt had once praised him in a speech at the Boosters' Club. But there was opposition from certain Episcopalian and Congregationalist ministers, those renegades whom Mr. Monday so finely called a bunch of gospel pushers with dishwater instead of blood, a gang of squealers that need more dust on their knees of their pants and more hair on their skinny old chests. This opposition had been crushed when the Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce had reported to a committee of manufacturers that in every city he had appeared Mr. Monday had turned the minds of workmen from wages and hours to higher things, and thus averted strikes. He was immediately invited. An expense fund of $40,000 had been underwritten. Out on the county fairgrounds a Mike Monday tabernacle had been erected to seat 15,000 people. In it the prophet was at this moment concluding his message. There are a lot of smart college professors and tea-guzzling slobs in this burg that say I'm a roughneck and a never-wasser, and my knowledge of history is not yet. Oh, there's a gang of woolly-whiskered book-lice that think they know more than Almighty God and prefer a lot of Hun science and smutty German criticism to the straight and simple Word of God. Oh, there's a swell bunch of Lizzie boys and lemon-suckers and pie-faces and infidels and beer-bloated scribblers that love to fire off their filthy mouths and yip that Mike Monday is vulgar and full of mush. Those pups are saying now that I hog the gospel show, that I'm in it for the coin. Well, now listen, folks. I'm going to give those birds a chance. They can stand up here and tell me to my face that I'm a galoot and a liar and a hick. Only if they do, don't faint with surprise if some of them's rum-dum liars get one good swift poke from Mike, with all the kick of God's flaming righteousness behind the wallop. Well, come on, folks. Who says it? Who says Mike Monday is a four-flush and a yahoo? Huh? I didn't see anybody standing up. Well, there you are. Now I guess the folks in this town will quit listening to all the cooyotting from behind the fence. I guess you'll quit listening to the guys that pan and roast and kick and beef and vomit out filthy atheism, and all of you'll come in with every grain of pep and reverence you got, and boost all together for Jesus Christ and His everlasting mercy and tenderness. At that moment Seneca Doane, the radical lawyer, and Dr. Kurt Yakovich, the histologist, whose report on the destruction of epithelial cells under radium had made the name of Zenith known in Munich, Prague, and Rome, were talking in Doane's library. Zenith's a city with gigantic power, gigantic buildings, gigantic machines, gigantic transportation, meditated Doane. I hate your city. It has standardized all the beauty out of life. It is one big railroad station with all the people taking tickets for the best cemeteries, Dr. Yavitch said placidly. Doane roused. I'm hanged if it is. You make me sick, Kurt, with your perpetual whine about standardization. Don't you suppose any other nation is standardized? Is anything more standardized than England, with every house that can afford it having the same muffins at the same tea hour, and every retired general going to exactly the same evensong at the same gray stone church with a square tower, and every golfing prig in Harris tweed saying, "Right you are," to every other prosperous ass? Yet I love England. And for standardization, look at the sidewalk cafes in France and the love-making in Italy. Standardization is excellent per se. When I buy an Ingersoll watch or a Ford, I get a better tool for less money, and I know precisely what I'm getting, and that leaves me more time and energy to be individual in. And I remember once in London I saw a picture of an American suburb in a toothpaste ad on the back of the Saturday Evening Post, an elm-lined snowy street of these new houses, Georgian some of them, or with low raking roofs, the kind of street you'd find here in Zenith, say in Floral Heights, open trees, grass, and I was homesick. There's no other country in the world that has such pleasant homes, and I don't care if they are standardized. It's a corking standard. No, what I fight in Zenith is standardization of thought, and, of course, the traditions of competition. The real villains of the piece are the clean, kind, industrious family men who use every known brand of trickery and cruelty to ensure the prosperity of their cubs. The worst thing about these fellows is that they're so good, and their work, at least, so intelligent. You can't hate them properly, and yet their standardized minds are the enemy. Then this boasting sneakingly, I have a notion that Zenith is a better place to live in than Manchester or Glasgow or Lyons or Berlin or Turin. It is not, and I have lived in most of them, demurred Dr. Yavitch. Well, matter of taste. Personally, I prefer a city with a future so unknown that it excites my imagination. But what I particularly want— You, said Dr. Yavitch, are a middle-road liberal, and you haven't the slightest idea of what you want. I, being a revolutionist, know exactly what I want, and what I want now is a drink. 6. At that moment in Zenith, Jake Offutt, the politician, and Henry T. Thompson were in conference. Offutt suggested, "The thing to do is get your fool son-in-law Babbitt to put it over. He's one of those patriotic guys. When he grabs a piece of property for the gang, he makes it look like we were dying of love for the dear peepful. And I do love to buy respectability. Reasonable. Wonder how long we can keep it up, Hank? We're safe as long as the good little boys like Georgie Babbitt and all the nice respectable labor leaders think you and me are rugged patriots. There's swell picking for an honest politician here, Hank. A whole city working to provide cigars and fried chickens and dried martinis for us, and rallying to our banner with indignation, oh, fierce indignation, whenever some squealer like this fellow Seneca Doane comes along. Honest, Hank, a smart codger like me ought to be ashamed of himself if he didn't milk cattle like them when they come around mooing for it. But the traction gang can't get away with grand larceny like it used to. I wonder when, Hank. I wish we could fix some way to run this fellow Seneca Doane out of town. It's him or us." At that moment in Zenith, 340 or 50,000 ordinary people were asleep, a vast unpenetrated shadow. In the slum beyond the railroad track, a young man who for 6 months had sought work turned on the gas and killed himself and his wife. At that moment Lloyd Mallam, the poet, owner of the Haffett's bookshop, was finishing a rondeau to show how diverting was life amid the feuds of medieval Florence, but how dull it was in so obvious a place as Zenith. And at that moment George F. Babbitt turned ponderously in bed, the last turn, signifying that he'd had enough of this worried business of falling asleep, and was about it in earnest. Instantly he was in the magic dream. He was somewhere among unknown people who laughed at him. He slipped away, ran down the path of a midnight garden, and at the gate the fairy child was waiting. Her dear and tranquil hand caressed his cheek. He was gallant and wise and well beloved. Warm ivory were her arms, and beyond perilous moors the brave sea glittered. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt. By Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 8. The great events of Babbitt's spring were the secret buying of real estate options in Linton for certain street traction officials before the public announcement that the Linton Avenue car line would be expanded, and a dinner, which was, as he rejoiced to his wife, not only a regular society spread, but a real sure-enough highbrow affair, with some of the keenest intellects and the brightest bunch of little women in town. It was so absorbing an occasion that he almost forgot his desire to run off to Maine with Paul Riesling. Though he had been born in the village of Catawba, Babbitt had risen to that metropolitan social plane on which hosts have as many as 4 people at dinner without planning it for more than an evening or two. But a dinner for 12, with flowers from the florist and all the cut glass out, staggered even the Babbitts. For 2 weeks they studied, debated, and arbitrated the list of guests. Babbitt marveled.
Of course we're up to date ourselves, but still, think of us entertaining a famous poet like Chum Frink, a fellow that on nothing but a poem or so every day and just writing a few advertisements pulls down 15,000 berries a year."
Yes, and Howard Littlefield. Do you know the other evening Eunice told me her papa speaks 3 languages,
said Mrs. Babbitt.
That's nothing. So do I. American, baseball, and poker."
I don't think it's nice to be funny about a matter like that. Think how wonderful it must be to speak 3 languages, and so useful, and with people like that, I don't see why we invite the Orville Joneses.
Well, now, Orville is a mighty up-and-comin' fellow.
Yes, I know, but a laundry?
I'll admit a laundry hasn't got the class of poetry or real estate, but just the same, Orvie is mighty deep. Ever start him spieling about gardening? Say, that fellow can tell you the name of every kind of tree, and some of their Greek and Latin names, too. Besides, we owe the Joneses a dinner. Besides, gosh, we got to have some boob for audience when a bunch of hot-air artists like Frink and Littlefield get going.
Well, dear, I meant to speak of this. I do think that as a host you ought to sit back and listen, and let your guests have a chance to talk once in a while.
Oh, you do you? Sure, I talk all the time, and I'm just a businessman. Oh, sure, I'm no Ph.D. like Littlefield, and no poet, and I haven't anything to spring. Well, let me tell you, just the other day your darn chum Frink comes up to me at the club begging to know what I thought about the Springfield school bond issue. And who told him? I did. You bet your life I told him. Little me, I certainly did. He came up and asked me, and I told him all about it. You bet. And he was darn glad to listen to me. Duty as a host. I guess I know my duty as a host, and let me tell you.
In fact, the Orville Joneses were invited. 2. On the morning of the dinner, Mrs. Babbitt was restive.
Now, George, I want you to be sure and be home early tonight. Remember, you have to dress.
I see by the Advocate that the Presbyterian General Assembly has voted to quit the interchurch world movement. That...
George, did you hear what I said? You must be home in time to dress tonight.
Dress, hell, I'm dressed now. Think I'm going down to the office in my BVDs?
I will not have you talking indecently before the children. And you do have to put on your dinner jacket.
I guess you mean my tux. I'll tell you, of all the doggone nonsensical nuisances that was ever invented.
3 minutes later, after Babbitt had wailed,
"Well, I don't know whether I'm going to dress or not,"
in a manner which showed that he was going to dress, the discussion moved on.
Now, George, you mustn't forget to call at Vecchia's on the way home and get ice cream. Their delivery wagon is broken down, and I don't want to trust them to send it by.
All right. You told me that before breakfast.
Well, I don't want you to forget. I'll be working my head off all day long, training the girl that's to help with the dinner.
All nonsense anyway, hiring an extra girl for the feed. Matilda could perfectly, well...
And I have to go out and buy flowers and fix them and set the table and order the salted almonds and look at the chickens and arrange the children to have their supper upstairs, and I simply must depend on you to go to Vecchia's for ice cream.
All right. Gosh, I'm going to get it.
All you have to do is go in and say you want the ice cream that Mrs. Babbitt ordered yesterday by phone, and it will be all ready for you.
At 10:30 she telephoned him not to forget the ice cream from Vecchia's. He was surprised and blasted then by a thought. He wondered whether Floral Heights dinners were worth the hideous toil involved. But he reprinted the sacrilege in the excitement of buying the materials for cocktails. Now this was the manner of obtaining alcohol under the reign of righteousness and prohibition. He drove from the severe rectangular streets of the modern business center into the tangled byways of Old Town, jagged blocks filled with sooty warehouses and lofts, on into the Arbor, once a pleasant orchard, but now a morass of lodging-houses, tenements, and brothels. Exquisite shivers chilled up his spine and stomach, and he looked at every policeman with intense innocence, as one who loved the law and admired the force, and longed to stop and play with them. He parked his car a block from the Healey Hansen saloon, worrying,
"Well, rats, if anybody did see me, they'd think I was out here on business."
He entered a place curiously like the saloons of ante-prohibition days, with a long, greasy bar with sawdust in front and streaky mirror behind, a pine table at which a dirty old man dreamed over a glass of something which resembled whiskey, and with two men at the bar drinking something which resembled beer, and giving that impression of forming a large crowd which two men always give in a saloon. The bartender, a tall, pale Swede with a diamond in his lilac scarf, stared at Babbitt as he stalked plumply up to the bar and whispered,
"I'd a friend of Hanson's sent me here. Like to get some gin?"
The bartender gazed down on him in the manner of an outraged bishop. "I guess you've got the wrong place, my friend. We sell nothing but soft drinks here." He cleaned the bar with a rag which would itself have done with a little cleaning, and glared across his mechanically moving elbow. The old dreamer at the table petitioned the bartender.
"Say, Oscar, listen."
Oscar did not listen.
Say, Oscar, listen, will you? Say, listen."
The decayed and drowsy voice of the loafer, the agreeable stink of beer dregs, threw a spell of initiation over Babbitt. The bartender moved grimly toward the crowd of two men. Babbitt followed him as delicately as a cat, and wheedled,
"Say, Oscar, I want to speak to Mr. Hanson."
"What you want to see him for?"
"I just want to talk to him. Here's my card."
It was a beautiful card, an engraved card, a card in the blackest black and the sharpest red, announcing that Mr. George F. Babbitt was estates, insurance, rents. The bartender held it as though it weighed 10 pounds, and read it as though it were 100 words long. He did not bend from his episcopal dignity, but he growled,
"I'll see if he's around."
From the back room he brought an immensely old young man, a quiet, sharp-eyed man in tan silk shirt, checkered vest hanging open, and burning brown trousers. Mr. Healey Hansen. Mr. Hansen said only, "Yeah?" But his implacable and contemptuous eyes queried Babbitt's soul, and he seemed not at all impressed by the new dark gray suit for which, as he had admitted to every acquaintance at the athletic club, Babbitt had paid $125.
"Glad to meet you, Mr. Hanson. Say, I'm George Babbitt of the Babbitt Thompson Realty Company. I'm a great friend of Jake Offutt's."
"What of it?"
"Say, I'm going to have a party, and Jake told me you'd be able to fix me up with a little gin."
In alarm, in obsequiousness, as Hanson's eyes grew more bored,
"You telephone to Jake about me if you want to."
Hanson answered by jerking his head to indicate the entrance to the back room, and strolled away. Babbitt, melodramatically, crept into an apartment containing 4 round tables, 11 chairs, a brewery calendar, and a smell. He waited. Thrice he saw Healey Hansen saunter through, humming, hands in pockets, ignoring him. By this time Babbitt had modified his valiant morning vow.
"I won't pay 1 cent over $7 a quart," to "I might pay 10.
On Hanson's next weary entrance he besought,
"Could you fix that up?"
Hanson scowled and grated, "Just a minute, Pete's sake, just a minute." In growing meekness Babbitt went on waiting till Hanson casually reappeared with a quart of gin, what is euphemistically known as a quart, in his disdainful long white hands. $12, he snapped.
Captain Jake thought you'd be able to fix me up for 8 or 9 a bottle."
"Nope, 12. This is the real stuff smuggled from Canada. This is none of your natural spirits with a drop of juniper extract." The honest merchant said virtuously, 12 bones if you want it. Of course, you understand. I'm just doing this anyway as a friend of Jake's."
Sure, I understand."
Babbitt gratefully held out $12. He felt honored by contact with greatness as Hanson yawned, stuffed the bills uncounted into his radiant vest, and swaggered away. He had a number of titillations out of concealing the gin bottle under his coat, and out of hiding it in his desk. All afternoon he snorted and chuckled and gurgled over his ability to "give the boys a real shot in the arm tonight." He was, in fact, so exhilarated that he was within a block of his house before he remembered that there was a certain matter, mentioned by his wife, of fetching ice cream from Vecchia's. He explained, "Oh, darn it," and drove back. Vecchia was not a caterer. He was the caterer of Zenith. Most coming-out parties were held in the white and gold ballroom of the Maison Vecchia. At all nice teas the guest recognized the 5 kinds of Vecchia sandwiches, and the 7 kinds of Vecchia cakes, and all really smart dinners ended as on a resolving chord: Vecchia Neapolitan ice cream in one of the 3 reliable molds: the melon mold, the round mold like a layer cake, and the long brick. Vecchia's shop had pale blue woodwork, tracery of plaster roses, attendants in frilled aprons, and glass shelves of kisses, with all the refinement that inheres in whites of eggs. Babbitt felt heavy, thick, amid this professional daintiness, and as he waited for the ice cream, he decided, with hot prickles at the back of his neck, that a girl customer was giggling at him. He went home in a touchy temper. The first thing he heard was his wife's agitated, "George, did you remember to go to Vecchia's and get ice cream?"
Say, look here, do I ever forget to do things?
"Yes, often."
Well, now, it's darn seldom I do, and it certainly makes me tired after going into a pink tea joint like Vecchia's, and having to stand around looking at a lot of half-naked young girls, all rouged up like they were 60 and eating a lot of stuff that simply ruins their stomachs.
"Oh, it's too bad about you. I have noticed how you hate to look at pretty girls." With a jar, Babbitt realized that his wife was too busy to be impressed by that moral indignation with which males rule the world, and he went humbly upstairs to dress. He had an impression of a glorified dining-room, of cut glass, candles, polished wood, lace, silver roses, with the awed swelling of the heart suitable to so grave a business as giving a dinner. He slew the temptation to wear his plaited dress shirt for the 4th time, took out an entirely fresh one, tightened his black bow, and rubbed his patent leather pumps with a handkerchief. He glanced with pleasure at his garnet and silver studs. He smoothed and patted his ankles, transformed by silk socks from the sturdy shanks of George Babbitt to the elegant limbs of what is called a clubman. He stood before the pier glass, viewing his trim dinner coat, his beautiful triple-braided trousers, and murmured in lyric beatitude, "By golly, I don't look bad. I certainly don't look like Catawba. If the Hicks back home could see me in this rig, they'd have a fit." He moved majestically down to mix the cocktails. As he chipped ice, as he squeezed oranges, as he collected vast stores of bottles, glasses, and spoons at the sink and in the pantry, he felt as authoritative as the bartender at Healey Hanson's saloon. True, Mrs. Babbitt said he was underfoot, and Matilda and the maid hired for the evening brushed by him, elbowed him, shrieked, "Please open the door," as they trotted through with trays. But in his high moment he ignored them. Besides the new bottle of gin, his cellar consisted of 1/2 bottle of bourbon whiskey, a quarter of a bottle of Italian vermouth, and approximately 100 drops of orange bitters. He did not possess a cocktail shaker. A shaker was proof of dissipation, the symbol of a drinker, and Babbitt disliked being known as a drinker, even more than he liked to drink. He mixed by pouring from an ancient gravy boat into a handleless pitcher. He poured with noble dignity, holding his alembics high beneath the powerful Mazda globe, his face hot, his shirt front a glaring white, the copper sink a scoured red gold. He tasted the sacred essence.
Now, by golly, if that isn't pretty near one fine old cocktail. Kind of a Bronx and yet like a Manhattan. Hey, Myra, want a little nip before the folks come?"
Bustling into the dining-room, moving each glass a quarter of an inch, rushing back with resolution implacable on her face, her gray and silver lace party frock protected by a denim towel. Mrs. Babbitt glared at him and rebuked him. "Certainly not."
Well,
In a loose, jocose manner.
I think the old man will.
The cocktail filled him with a whirling exhilaration beyond which he was aware of devastating desires. To rush places in fast motors, to kiss girls, to sing, to be witty. He sought to regain his lost dignity by announcing to Matilda,
I'm going to stick this pitcher of cocktails in the refrigerator. Be sure you don't upset any of 'em.
"Yeah."
Well, be sure now. Don't go putting anything on the top shelf.
"Yeah."
Well, be...
He was dizzy. His voice was thin and distant. With enormous impressiveness he commanded,
Well, be sure now.
and minced into the safety of the living-room. He wondered whether he could persuade,
As slow as bunch as Myra and the Littlefields to go some place to have dinner and raise Cain and maybe dig up some more booze.
he perceived that he had gifts of profligacy which had been neglected. By the time the guests had come, including the inevitable late couple for whom the others waited with painful immovability, a great gray emptiness had replaced the purple swirling in Babbitt's head, and he had to force the tumultuous greetings suitable to a host on Floral Heights. The guests were Howard Littlefield, the doctor of philosophy who furnished publicity and comforting economics to the Street Traction Company; Vergil Gunch, the coal dealer, equally powerful in the Elk and in the Boosters' Club; Eddie Swanson, the agent for the Javelin Motor Car, who lived across the street; and Orville Jones, owner of the Lily White Laundry, which justly announced itself the biggest, busiest, bulliest cleaneries shop in Zenith. But naturally the most distinguished of all was T. Charmolly Fink, who was not only the author of Polydamas, which, syndicated daily in 67 leading newspapers, gave him one of the largest audiences of any poet in the world, but also an optimistic lecturer and the creator of Ads That Add. Despite the searching philosophy and high morality of his verses, they were humorous and easily understood by any child of 12, and it added a neat air of pleasantry to them that they were set not as verse but as prose. Mr. Frink was known from coast to coast as Chum. With them were 6 wives, more or less. It was hard to tell, so early in the evening, as at first glance they all looked alike, and as they all said, "Oh, isn't this nice?" in the same tone of determined liveliness. To the eye the men were less similar. Littlefield, a hedge scholar, tall and horse-faced; Chum Frink, a trifle of a man, with soft and mouse-like hair, advertising his profession as poet by a silk cord on his eyeglasses; Vergil Gunch, broad, with coarse black hair, embrosse; Eddie Swanson, a bald and bouncing young man who showed his taste for elegance by an evening waistcoat of figured black silk with glass buttons; Orville Jones, a steady-looking, stubby, not very memorable person, with a hemp-colored toothbrush mustache. Yet they were all so well fed and clean, they all shouted "Evening, Georgie," with such robustness that they seemed to be cousins. And the strange thing is that the longer one knew the women, the less alike they seemed, while the longer one knew the men, the more alike their bold patterns appeared. The drinking of the cocktails was as canonical a rite as the mixing. The company waited uneasily, hopefully, agreeing in a strained manner that the weather had been rather warm and slightly cold, but still Babbitt said nothing about drinks. They became despondent. But when the late couple, the Swansons, had arrived, Babbitt hinted,
Well, folks, you think we could stand breaking the law a little?
They looked at Chum Frink, the recognized lord of language. Frink pulled at his eyeglass cord as if a bell rope. He cleared his throat and said that which was the custom, "I'll tell you, George, I'm a law-abiding man, but they do say Verg Gunch is a regular yegg, and of course he's bigger'n I am, and I just can't figure out what I'd do if he tried to force me into anything criminal."
Gunch was roaring, "Well, I'll take a chance."
when Frink held up his hand and went on, "So, Virgin, you insist. Georgie, I'll park my car on the wrong side of the street because I take it for granted that's the crime you're hinting at." There was a great deal of laughter. Mrs. Jones asserted, "Mr. Frink is simply too killing. You'd think he was so innocent." Babbitt clamored, "How did you guess it, chum? Well, you all just wait a moment while I go out and get the keys to your cars." Through a froth of merriment he brought the shining promise, the mighty tray of glasses with the cloudy yellow cocktails in the glass pitcher in the center. The men babbled, "Oh, gosh, have a look," and "This gets me right where I live," and "Let me at it." But Chum Frink, a traveled man and not unused to woes, was stricken by the thought that the potion might be merely fruit juice with a little natural spirits. He looked timid as Babbitt, a moist and ecstatic almoner, held out a glass. But as he tasted it, he plied, "Oh, man, let me dream on. It ain't true, but don't waken me. Just let me slumber." 2 hours before, Frink had completed a newspaper lyric beginning, "I sat alone and groused and thunk, and scratched my head and sighed and wunk, and groaned. There are still black who like the old-time gin-mill back, that den that makes a sage a loon, the vile and smelly old saloon. I'll never miss her poison booze, whilst the bubbling spring I can use, that leaves my head at merry morn as clear as any babe new-born." Babbitt drank with the others. His moment's depression was gone. He perceived that these were the best fellows in the world. He wanted to give them 1,000 cocktails. "Think you could stand another?" he cried. The wives refused with giggles, but the men, speaking in a wide, elaborate, enjoyable manner, gloated, "Well, sooner than have you get sore at me, Georgie." "You got a little dividend coming," said Babbitt to each of them, and each in tone, "Squeeze it, Georgie, squeeze it." When beyond hope the pitcher was empty, they stood and talked about prohibition. The men leaned back on their heels, put their hands in their trousers pockets, and proclaimed their views with the booming profundity of a prosperous male repeating a thoroughly hackneyed statement about a matter of which he knows nothing whatever. "Now, I'll tell you," said Vergil Gunch. "Way I figure it is this, and I can speak by the book because I've talked to a lot of doctors and fellows that ought to know, and the way I see it is that it's a good thing to get rid of the saloon, but they ought to let a fellow have beer and light wines." Howard Littlefield observed, "What isn't generally recognized is that it's a dangerous proposition to invade the rights of personal liberty. Now, take this for instance. The King of Bavaria, I think it was Bavaria? Yes, Bavaria it was, in 1862, March 1862, he issued a proclamation against public grazing of livestock. The peasantry had stood for overtaxation without the slightest complaint, but when this proclamation came out they rebelled. Or it may have been Saxony, but it just goes to show the dangers of invading the rights of personal liberty." "That's it. No one got a right to invade personal liberty," said Orville Jones. "Just the same, you don't want to forget prohibition is a mighty good thing for the working class. Keeps them from wasting their money and lowering their productiveness," said Vergil Gunch. "Yes, that's so, but the trouble is the manner of enforcement," insisted Howard Littlefield. "Congress didn't understand the right system. Now, if I'd been running the thing, I'd have arranged it so the drinker himself was licensed, and then we could have taken care of the shiftless workman, keep him from drinking, and yet not have interfered with the rights, with the personal liberty of fellows like ourselves." They bobbed their heads, looked admiringly at one another, and stated, "That's so. That wouldn't be a stunt." "Thing that worries me is a lot of these guys will take to cocaine," sighed Eddie Swanson. They bobbed more violently and groaned, "That's so. There is danger of that." Chum Frink chanted, "Oh, say, I got hold of a swell new recipe for homemade beer the other day. You take—" Gunch interrupted, "Wait, let me tell you mine." Littlefield snorted, "Beer rats! Things to do to ferment cider." Jones insisted, "I've got the recipe that does the business," Swanson begged. "Oh, say, let me tell you the story." But Frink went on resolutely. You take and save the shells from peas, and pour 6 gallons of water on a bushel of shells, and boil the mixture till Mrs. Babbitt turned them with yearning sweetness. Frank hastened to finish even his best beer recipe, and she said gaily, "Dinner is served." There was a good deal of friendly argument among the men as to which should go in last, and while they were crossing the hall from the living room to the dining room, Vergil Gunch made them laugh by thundering, "If I can't sit next to Myra Babbitt and hold her hand at the table, I won't play. I'm going home." In the dining room they stood embarrassed, while Mrs. Babbitt fluttered, "Now let me see. Oh, I was going to have some nice hand-painted place cards for you, but let me see. Mr. Frink, would you sit here?" The dinner was in the best style of women's magazine art, whereby the salad was served in hollowed apples, and everything but the invincible fried chicken resembled something else. Ordinarily the men found it hard to talk to the women. Flirtation was an art unknown on Floral Heights, and the realms of offices and of kitchens had no alliances. But under the inspiration of cocktails, conversation was violent. Each of the men still had a number of important things to say about prohibition, and now that each had a loyal listener in his dinner partner, he burst out, "I found a place where I can get all the hooch I want at 8 a quart. Did you read about this fellow that went and paid $1,000 for 10 cases of red-eye that proved to be nothing but water? Seems the fellow was standing on the corner, and the fellow comes up to him. They say there's a whole raft of stuff being smuggled across at Detroit. What I always say is, what a lot of folks don't realize about prohibition, and then when you get all this awful poison stuff, wood alcohol and everything. Of course I believe in it on principle, but I don't propose to have anybody tell me what I got to think and do. No American will ever stand for that." But they all felt that it was rather in bad taste for Orville Jones, and he not recognized as one of the wits of the occasion anyway, to say, "In fact, the whole thing about prohibition is this: it isn't the initial cost, it's the humidity." Not till the one required topic had been dealt with did the conversation become general. It was often, and admittedly, said of Vergil Gunch, "Gee, that fellow can get away with murder. Why, he can pull a raw one in mixed company, and all the ladies'll laugh their heads off. But me, gosh, if I crack anything that's just the least bit off color, I get razzed for fair." Now Gunch delighted them by crying to Mrs. Eddie Swanson, youngest of the women, "Louetta, I managed to pinch Eddie Dorky out of his pocket, and what say you we sneak across the street when the folks aren't looking? Got something," with a gorgeous leer, "awful important to tell you." The women wriggled, and Babbitt was stirred to like naughtiness. "Say, folks, I wish I'd dared to show you a book I borrowed from Doc Pattern." "Now, George, the idea!" Mrs. Babbitt warned him. "This book, racy isn't the word. It's some kind of anthropological report about customs in the South Seas. And what it doesn't say, it's a book you can't buy. Verge, I'll lend it to you." "Me first," insisted Eddie Swanson. "Sounds spicy." Orville Jones announced, "Say, I heard a good one the other day about a couple of Swedes and their wives." And in the best Jewish accent he resolutely carried the good one to a slightly disinfected ending. Gunch capped it, but the cocktails waned, the seekers dropped back into cautious reality. Chum Frink had recently been on a lecture tour among the small towns, and he chuckled, "Awful good to get back to civilization. I certainly been seeing some hick towns. I mean, of course the folks there are the best on earth, but gee whiz, those Main Street burgs are slow. And you fellows can't hardly appreciate what it means to be here with a bunch of live ones." "You bet," exulted Orville Jones. "They're the best folks on earth, those small town folks. But, oh, mama, what conversation! Why, say, they can't talk about anything but the weather and the Neo Ford. By Hackleman!" "That's right. They all talk just about the same things," said Eddie Swanson. "Don't they, though? They just say the same things over and over," said Vergil Gunch. "Yes, it's really remarkable. They seem to lack all power of looking at things impersonally. They simply go over and over the same talk about Fords and the weather and so on," said Howard Littlefield. Still, at that, you can't blame 'em. They haven't got any intellectual stimulus such as you get up here in the city," said Chum Frink.
"Gosh, that's right," said Babbitt. "I don't want you highbrows to get stuck on yourself, but I must say it keeps a fellow right up on his toes to sit with a poet and with Howard, the guy that put the con in economics. But these small-town boobs, with nobody but each other to talk to, no wonder they get so sloppy and uncultured in their speech and so balled up in their thinking."
Orville Jones commented, "And then take our other advantages. The movies, for instance. Those Yapville sports think they're all get out if they have one change of bill a week, where here in the city you got your choice of a dozen different movies any evening you want to name."
"Sure, the inspiration we get from rubbing up against high-class hustlers every day and getting jam full of ginger," said Eddie Swanson.
"Same time," said Babbitt, "no sense excusing those Rube Bergs too easy. Fellow's own fault if he don't show the initiative to up and beat it to the city, like we did. And just speaking in confidence among friends, they're jealous as a devil of a city man. Every time I go up to Catawba I have to go around apologizing to the fellows I was brought up with because I've more or less succeeded and they haven't. And if you talk natural to 'em, way we do here, and show finesse and what you might call a broad point of view, why, they think you're putting on the side. There's my own half-brother Martin. Runs the little old general store my dad used to keep. Say, I'll bet he don't know there is such a thing as a tux, as a dinner jacket. If he was to come up here now, he'd think we were a bunch of why, gosh, I swear he wouldn't know what to think. Yes, sir, they're jealous."
Chum Frink agreed. "That's so, but what I mind is their lack of culture and appreciation of the beautiful. If you'll excuse me for being highbrow, now I like to give a high-class lecture and read some of my best poetry. Not the newspaper stuff, but the magazine things. But say, when I get in the tall grass, there's nothing will take but a lot of cheesy old stories and slang and junk that if any of us were to indulge in it here, he'd get the gate so fast it would make his head swim." Versa Gunch summed up,
"Fact is, we're mighty lucky to be living among a bunch of city folks that recognize artistic things and business punch equally. We'd feel pretty glum if we got stuck in some Main Street burg and tried to wise up the old codgers to a kind of life we're used to here. But by golly, there's this you got to say for 'em. Every small American town is trying to get population and modern ideals, and darn if a lot of 'em don't put it across. Somebody starts planning a Rube Crossroads, telling how he was here in 1900 and it consisted of one muddy street, count 'em, one, and 900 human clams. Well, you go back there in 1920 and you find pavement and a swell little hotel and a first-class ladies' ready-to-wear shop. Real perfection, in fact. You don't want to just look at what these small towns are. You want to look at what they're aiming to become. And they all got an ambition that in the long run is going to make 'em the finest spots on earth. They all want to be just like Zenith."
3. However intimate they might be with T. Charmaldy Chink as a neighbor, as a borrower of lawn-mowers and monkey-wrenches, they knew that he was also a famous poet and a distinguished advertising agent, that behind his easiness were sultry literary mysteries which they could not penetrate. But tonight, in the gin-evolved confidence, he admitted them to an arcanum. "I've got a literary problem that's worrying me to death. I'm doing a series of ads for the Zeeco car, and I want to make each of 'em a real little gem. Regular stylistic stuff. I'm all for this theory that perfection is the stunt, or nothing at all. And these are as tough things as I've tackled. You might think it'd be harder to do my poems, all these heart topics, home and fireside and happiness, but they're cinches. You can't go wrong on 'em. And you know what sentiments any decent go-ahead fellow must have if he plays the game, and you stick right to 'em. But the poetry of industrialism, now there's a literary line where you got to open up new territory. Do you know the fellow who's really the American genius? The fellow who you don't know his name, and I don't either, but his work ought to be preserved so future generations can judge our American thought and originality today.
Why, the fellow that writes the Prince Albert tobacco ads. Just listen to this. It's P.A. that jams such joy in Jiminy pipes. Say, bet you've often bent an ear to that spill of speech about hopping from 5 to 50 per by stepping on her a bit. Guess that's going some, all right, but just among ourselves, you'd better start a rapid whiz system to keep tabs as to how fast you'll buzz from low-smoke spirits to tip-top high. Once you line up behind a Jiminy pipe, it's all aglow with such a peach of a pal, Prince Albert. Prince Albert is John on the job, always joyously more-ish in flavor, always delightfully cool and fragrant. For a fact, you never hooked such a double-decked, copper-riveted, two-fisted smoke enjoyment. Go to a pipe. Speedo quick like you light on a good thing. Why, packed with Prince Albert, you can play a joyously Jimmy straight across the boards, and you know what that means. Now that, caroled motor agent Eddie Swenson, that's what I call literature, that Prince Albert fellow. Though, gosh, there can't be just one fellow that writes 'em. Must be a big board of classy ink slingers in conference. But anyway, now he doesn't write for long-haired pikers. He writes for regular guys. He writes for me, and I tip my beanie to him. The only thing is, I wonder if it sells the goods. Course, like these poets, this Prince Albert fellow lets his idea run away with him. It makes elegant reading, but it don't say nothing. I never go out and buy Prince Albert tobacco after reading it, because it doesn't tell me anything about the stuff. It's just a bunch of fluff. Frink faced him. Oh, you're crazy. Have I got to sell you the idea of style? Anyway, that's the kind of stuff I'd like to do for the Zico, but I simply can't, so I decided to stick to the straight poetic, and I took a shot at a highbrow ad for the Zico. How do you like this? The long white trail is calling, calling, and it's over the hills and far away for every man or woman that has red blood in his veins, and on his lips the ancient song of the buccaneers. It's away with dull drudging, and a fig for care, speed, glorious speed. It's more than just a moment's exhilaration. It's life for you and me. This great new truth the makers of Zico car have considered as much as price and style. It's fleet as the antelope, smooth as the glide of a swallow, yet powerful as the charge of a bull elephant. Class breathes in every line. Listen, brother, you'll never know what the high art of hiking is till you try life's zipping a zest, the Zico. Yes, Frink mused, that's got an elegant color to it, if I do say so, but it ain't got the originality of spill of speech. The whole company sighed with sympathy and admiration. End of Chapter 8.